In this video, we are going to break down 2 hours of Stewie's darkest ever moments. Let's get started with the time Stewie actually succeeded in killing his mother. The most shocking moment in Family Guy history is the one where Stewie Griffin finally achieved what he had been plotting since the very first episode, the murder of his mother, Lois. This was not just another of his failed schemes, or the kind of cartoon violence that gets reversed by the next scene. In Stewie Kills Lois, the baby genius actually pulls the trigger and seemingly ends his mother's life in the most brutal way possible. The setup for this dark turn begins innocently enough. It is Lois's birthday, and the Griffin family is gathered around the dinner table for what should be a celebration. The family gives her their typical mediocre gifts, nothing particularly special or thoughtful. Then Brian, the family dog, steps forward with something different, a pair of cruise tickets. Lois immediately assumes these tickets are for her and Peter to enjoy a romantic getaway together, leaving the children at home. This assumption proves to be the catalyst for everything that follows. Stewie, who has always harbored intense feelings about being left out of family activities, becomes absolutely furious when he realizes that once again, he is being excluded from something important. The cruise represents more than just a vacation to Stewie. It is another example of how his parents do not consider him worthy of inclusion in their adult world, despite his superior intelligence and sophisticated understanding of complex matters. What makes this situation particularly dark is how it reveals the depth of Stewie's psychological wounds. Throughout the series, we have seen hints that his matricidal tendencies stem from feeling constantly thwarted and dismissed by Lois. She unknowingly interferes with his schemes, not out of malice, but simply because she treats him like the baby he appears to be, rather than the genius he actually is. This cruise exclusion becomes the final straw in a lifetime of perceived slights and dismissals. Stewie's anger is not just about missing a vacation, it is about the fundamental disconnect between how he sees himself and how his family treats him. He possesses the intellectual capacity of an adult, the technological skills of a mad scientist, and the strategic thinking of a military general. Yet his mother continues to treat him as nothing more than a helpless infant who needs diaper changes and baby food. This psychological dynamic has been building throughout the entire series. Every time Lois picks him up when he does not want to be held, every time she interferes with his plans without understanding their complexity, every time she dismisses his sophisticated vocabulary as baby babble, these moments have been accumulating in Stewie's mind like pressure in a volcano ready to explode. Brian, who serves as something of a voice of reason in the Griffin household, initially dismisses Stewie's threats as more of the same empty bluster he has been spouting for years. Throughout the series, Stewie has made countless declarations about killing Lois, building elaborate weapons, and planning her demise. Every single time, these plans have either failed spectacularly or been abandoned when Stewie gets distracted by something else. Brian has witnessed this pattern so many times that he has become completely desensitized to Stewie's murderous rhetoric. This dismissive attitude from Brian proves to be a crucial mistake. When Stewie declares that this time will be different, that he will finally prove he has what it takes to commit matricide, Brian laughs it off as just another empty threat. He reminds Stewie of all the previous times he has made similar claims, pointing out that despite all his intelligence and technological capabilities, Stewie has never actually followed through on his ultimate goal. However, Brian's mockery only serves to fuel Stewie's determination. The baby genius becomes absolutely fixated on proving his friend wrong, on demonstrating that he truly is capable of the ultimate act of rebellion against parental authority. This psychological dynamic transforms what might have been another temporary tantrum into a genuine murder plot with real stakes and consequences. Meanwhile, Peter and Lois embark on their cruise, completely unaware of the danger that is approaching. The cruise ship setting initially provides typical Family Guy humor, with Peter embarrassing himself and Lois in various ways. He proves to be his usual obnoxious self, completely misunderstanding social situations and making crude comments that humiliate his wife in front of other passengers. Peter's behavior on the cruise reaches new levels of inappropriate conduct. He relieves himself on the poop deck, apparently thinking this is what the area is actually for. He makes incorrect movie references, insisting that Philip Seymour Hoffman was the lead actress in Titanic instead of Kate Winslet. Most damaging of all, he shares completely inappropriate stories about their family at the captain's dinner table, including details about how they almost aborted Meg. These embarrassing incidents create serious tension between Peter and Lois, leading to arguments and frustration that make their romantic getaway feel more like a nightmare. Lois finds herself increasingly isolated and upset, dealing not only with Peter's behavior, but also with the social awkwardness of being associated with his antics. The other passengers begin to avoid them, and what should have been a relaxing vacation becomes a source of stress and humiliation. The mounting tension between Peter and Lois reaches a breaking point when she can no longer tolerate his behavior. She storms off to be alone, needing space to process her frustration and disappointment. This moment of vulnerability, when Lois is isolated and emotionally distraught, creates the perfect opportunity for what comes next. What happens next demonstrates the true extent of Stewie's determination and resourcefulness. Rather than simply waiting at home and plotting his revenge after his parents' return, Stewie takes immediate action. Using his advanced technological capabilities, he somehow manages to acquire and operate a speedboat, tracking down the cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. This detail is crucial because it shows that Stewie's plan is not impulsive or emotional. It is calculated and methodical. He did not just grab a weapon in a moment of rage. Instead, he planned out how to locate a moving cruise ship, obtained the necessary transportation, navigated ocean waters, and approached his target with military precision. This level of premeditation makes what follows even more chilling. The image of a 1-year-old baby piloting a speedboat across the ocean to hunt down his mother is both absurd and terrifying. It perfectly captures the dark comedy that Family Guy is known for, while also highlighting just how dangerous Stewie can be when he puts his mind to something. His appearance on the ship represents the collision of his childish appearance with his adult-level capability for violence. When Stewie finally confronts Lois on the deck of the cruise ship, the scene takes on an almost surreal quality. Lois, who had gone outside to deal with her frustration over Peter's behavior, is completely shocked to see her baby on the ship. Her first reaction is not fear or understanding of the danger. It is confusion about how he could have possibly gotten there. This moment perfectly encapsulates the fundamental disconnect that has driven Stewie to this point. Even when faced with clear evidence of her son's extraordinary capabilities, the fact that he somehow traveled across the ocean to reach her, Lois still cannot fully grasp what she is dealing with. She is so accustomed to thinking of him as just a baby that she cannot process the reality of the situation, even when it is right in front of her. Stewie's demeanor during this confrontation is particularly chilling. He does not rant or rave or explain his motivations. He does not give a villain speech about his plans for world domination. Instead, he is calm, focused, and businesslike. This is not a crime of passion, it is an execution carried out with cold precision. What happens next is that Stewie produces a machine gun and, after only a brief moment of tension, opens fire on his mother. The episode does not shy away from the brutality of this moment. Lois's chest is graphically riddled with bullets, showing the devastating impact of automatic weapons fire on a human body. The choice to use a machine gun rather than a single shot or some elaborate contraption is significant. It shows that Stewie is not interested in a clean, quick death or some overly complicated scheme. He wants to ensure that there is no possibility of survival, no chance for last-minute rescue or medical intervention. The sustained automatic fire guarantees that his mother will die, and die horribly. The visual of Lois falling overboard after being shot multiple times is genuinely disturbing, even by Family Guy standards. Her body plunges into the ocean depths, leaving a cloud of blood in the water as she sinks. This imagery drives home the finality and brutality of what Stewie has accomplished. There is no cartoon physics here, no magical reversal, just a mother's body disappearing into the dark ocean after being murdered by her own child. Perhaps most disturbing of all is Stewie's reaction to successfully killing his mother. He does not show remorse, shock, or even surprise at what he has accomplished. Instead, he is absolutely ecstatic. This moment represents the culmination of everything he has been working toward since the series began, and his joy is genuine and complete. This reaction reveals the true depth of Stewie's psychological disturbance. A normal person, even one driven to violence by extreme circumstances, would likely feel some level of horror or regret after taking a life, especially that of a family member. But Stewie feels nothing but triumph. He has proven himself capable of the ultimate act of power over another person, and he revels in that accomplishment. The satisfaction Stewie displays also validates his long-held belief that he is superior to the adults around him. By successfully planning and executing his mother's murder, he has demonstrated that he possesses capabilities that surpass those of the people who have been treating him like a helpless infant. In his mind, this act proves once and for all that he deserves to be taken seriously. After killing Lois, Stewie does not panic or flee the scene. Instead, he calmly returns home and begins living his life as if nothing has happened. When Lois is reported missing from the cruise ship, Stewie plays the role of the innocent baby perfectly. He shows no signs of guilt or unusual behavior that might arouse suspicion. This ability to compartmentalize and deceive demonstrates another layer of Stewie's psychological sophistication. Not only was he capable of planning and executing a murder, but he can also maintain an elaborate deception over an extended period. He understands how investigations work, how suspicion develops, and how to avoid drawing attention to himself. The fact that Stewie keeps souvenirs of his crime, such as drawings depicting various ways of killing Lois and the gun he used, shows both his pride in the accomplishment and his confidence that he will not be caught. These mementos represent trophies of his greatest achievement, proof of his transformation from would-be world conqueror to actual killer. The episode reveals how the Griffin family adapts to life without Lois over the course of a year. Each family member processes the loss differently, creating a new dynamic that shows both the impact of her absence and the family's resilience. Peter begins dating other women, including a cancer patient, demonstrating his attempt to move on while also highlighting his characteristic lack of sensitivity. Chris has been told that his mother is away at a health spa, protecting him from the truth of her death. This deception requires ongoing effort from the family and shows their desire to shield the children from trauma. However, it also creates a complex web of lies that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Most tellingly, Meg apparently begins to flourish after her mother's death. According to Stewie's observation, Meg has really begun to bloom in Lois's absence. This dark detail suggests that Lois's presence may have been somehow stifling or harmful to Meg's development, adding another layer of moral complexity to the situation. Brian's character serves as the audience's moral compass throughout this ordeal. Initially dismissive of Stewie's threats, he becomes increasingly disturbed as he begins to suspect the truth. When Stewie finally admits that Lois's death was not an accident, but a deliberate murder, Brian's horror is genuine and complete. This revelation forces Brian to confront the fact that he has been living with a murderer for an entire year. Someone he considered a friend, despite their differences, has committed the ultimate crime and been deceiving everyone around him. Brian's decision to pursue justice represents his attempt to restore moral order to a situation that has spiraled completely out of control. The dynamic between Brian and Stewie during this period is particularly complex. Brian knows that exposing Stewie means destroying the family and potentially putting himself in danger from someone who has already proven capable of murder. Yet his conscience will not allow him to remain silent about such a horrific crime. When Peter mentions that Lois's life insurance policy has paid out, it creates suspicion among his friends Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland. The timing of the policy, taken out during the cruise right after Peter and Lois had a fight, makes Peter look like the prime suspect in his wife's murder. This development shows how easily circumstantial evidence can point investigators in the wrong direction. The discovery of Stewie's drawings and murder weapon in the family's garbage should have solved the case immediately. However, because the handwriting on the drawings resembles Peter's, and because no one can conceive of a baby being capable of such a crime, the evidence only serves to further incriminate Peter. This misinterpretation of evidence highlights how preconceptions about age and capability can blind people to the truth. Stewie's reaction to this development reveals his calculating nature. Rather than feeling guilty about his father being blamed for his crime, he is ecstatic that it appears he has pulled off the perfect murder. This response shows that Stewie's lack of empathy extends beyond his mother to include his entire family. He is willing to let his father go to prison for life, rather than take responsibility for his own actions. In short, Stewie Kills Lois shows Stewie's transformation from a would-be villain to an actual murderer. Beginning with his exclusion from a family cruise, his rage builds to the point where he tracks down the ship and shoots his mother with a machine gun, watching her body sink into the ocean. His complete satisfaction with the murder, combined with his ability to deceive everyone for a year while his father faces wrongful prosecution, demonstrates the true depth of his psychological disturbance. The episode explores themes of family dysfunction, the consequences of dismissing someone's capabilities, and the horror of living with a killer who appears innocent on the surface. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Chick Cancer and the time Stewie set Olivia and Victor on fire in the playhouse. One of Stewie Griffin's most disturbing acts of violence occurs in this episode, where his capacity for jealousy and revenge reaches truly horrifying levels. This incident represents a turning point in how viewers understand Stewie's psychological makeup, showing that his violent tendencies are not limited to family members or random strangers. They extend to people he claims to love. The episode begins with Stewie learning that his old friend Olivia Fuller, a child actress, is making what appears to be her final public appearance. Olivia's Hollywood career is crumbling because her Tasty Juice advertisement campaign has been dropped, marking the end of her time in the spotlight. She is making one last appearance at the Quahog Mall to open a new store, and Stewie initially decides to attend this event for the worst possible reasons. Stewie's first instinct is not to support his old friend during what must be a difficult time in her young life. Instead, he wants to go to the mall specifically to gloat over her misfortune. This reveals the cruel streak that runs through Stewie's personality. He takes pleasure in seeing others fail, even people he once considered friends. The fact that he would want to mock a child whose career is ending shows just how lacking he is in basic empathy and compassion. However, Stewie's plans for mockery completely change when he actually sees Olivia again. Rather than feeling superior or satisfied by her reduced circumstances, he finds himself falling in love with her all over again. This sudden shift from cruelty to infatuation demonstrates how quickly Stewie's emotions can change and how intense his feelings become once they take hold. The reunion between Stewie and Olivia initially seems sweet and innocent, two young children reconnecting after time apart, finding comfort in each other's company during what should be a simple friendship. But from the very beginning, there are signs that Stewie's feelings are more intense and possessive than what would be considered normal or healthy, even for adult relationships. Olivia, for her part, does not immediately return Stewie's romantic feelings. She seems to view their reconnection more as a renewal of friendship than the beginning of a serious relationship. This mismatch in expectations and emotional investment sets the stage for everything that follows, creating a dynamic where Stewie becomes increasingly desperate to win her affections. Confused about how to make Olivia like him romantically, Stewie turns to Brian for advice about relationships. This consultation leads to one of the episode's most disturbing elements, Stewie's observation of how their neighbor Glenn Quagmire interacts with women. When Stewie and Brian witness Quagmire being mean to a woman and seemingly getting positive results, Stewie draws a completely wrong conclusion about how relationships should work. This moment is particularly dark because it shows how Stewie's lack of real-world experience makes him vulnerable to learning toxic relationship patterns. He sees Quagmire's manipulative behavior and decides that being cruel and controlling is the key to romantic success. This misunderstanding of human relationships becomes the foundation for how Stewie approaches his relationship with Olivia. The fact that Stewie bases his relationship strategy on Quagmire's behavior is especially troubling given what viewers know about Quagmire's character. Using someone with such problematic attitudes toward women as a role model practically guarantees that Stewie will develop unhealthy relationship patterns. But Stewie lacks the emotional maturity and life experience to recognize that what he is witnessing is not actually successful relationship behavior. Following this misguided advice, Stewie begins pursuing Olivia more aggressively, and they do start spending time together as a couple. They enjoy moments together in the park, making fun of various people they observe. These scenes initially seem charming, two children bonding over shared observations and humor, laughing together at the quirks of the adults around them. During these park scenes, Stewie and Olivia mock a man who keeps smelling his hand, a Jewish cowboy, someone who cuts his own hair, and an uptight man. While their commentary is mean-spirited, it appears to bring them closer together. Olivia even tells Stewie that she is glad she gave him another chance and calls him a really special guy. For a moment, it seems like their relationship might actually work. These happy moments make what happens later even more disturbing. Stewie experiences genuine joy and connection with Olivia during this period. He tells her he cannot think of anywhere he would rather be than with her in that moment. This suggests that Stewie is capable of real affection and happiness in relationships, which makes his eventual violent reaction all the more shocking and tragic. However, the relationship quickly begins to deteriorate as the reality of their different personalities and expectations becomes apparent. They start arguing constantly, turning what should be fun activities into sources of conflict and tension. Their communication breaks down as both children struggle with emotions and relationship dynamics they are too young to fully understand. One particularly telling scene occurs during a dinner date in their playhouse. When Olivia serves Play-Doh spaghetti for dinner, Stewie makes a sarcastic comment about having had the same thing the night before. This leads to an argument where Stewie accuses them of being in a sexless marriage, despite admitting that he thinks sex is a kind of cake. This exchange shows how Stewie is trying to apply adult relationship concepts to a situation he does not fully comprehend. The argument escalates when Olivia questions whether Stewie even knows what sex is, which clearly embarrasses and angers him. Rather than admitting his ignorance, Stewie becomes defensive and tries to redirect the conversation. This pattern, Stewie feeling insecure about his knowledge or experience and responding with anger, becomes a recurring theme in their relationship. The relationship reaches its lowest point during a double date with Brian and his girlfriend Jillian. What should be a fun social activity becomes a disaster as Stewie and Olivia continue their pattern of constant bickering in front of their friends. Stewie creates a scene in the restaurant, getting into a confrontation with another patron who asks him to keep quiet. During this restaurant incident, Stewie's behavior becomes increasingly erratic and aggressive. When a man politely asks him to quiet down, Stewie responds with hostility and attempts to start a fight. This scene demonstrates how Stewie's frustration with his relationship is spilling over into other areas of his life, making him more volatile and unpredictable in all his interactions. The double date scene is particularly cringeworthy because it shows how Stewie and Olivia's dysfunction affects everyone around them. Brian and Jillian are clearly uncomfortable with the constant arguing and tension. The restaurant patron just wants to enjoy his meal in peace, but Stewie and Olivia are so caught up in their own drama that they cannot see how their behavior is impacting others. In a moment of apparent desperation to save their relationship, Stewie and Olivia decide to get married. Rupert, Stewie's teddy bear, officiates the ceremony, which adds a surreal and childish element to what they are trying to treat as a serious adult commitment. This marriage represents both children's attempt to solve their relationship problems through a formal commitment rather than addressing their underlying incompatibilities. Unfortunately, marriage does not solve any of their problems. Instead, it seems to make everything worse. Their relationship does not get any better after the wedding. If anything, the pressure and expectations of marriage appear to intensify their existing conflicts and create new sources of stress. The failure of their marriage is particularly significant because it represents Stewie's first real experience with romantic disappointment. Up until this point, most of his failed schemes involved external obstacles or other people interfering with his plans. But his relationship with Olivia fails, despite both of them wanting it to work, forcing Stewie to confront the possibility that some problems cannot be solved through intelligence, planning, or determination. Recognizing that Stewie is struggling with the relationship's problems, Brian tries to provide emotional support and guidance. There is a scene clearly inspired by Good Will Hunting, where Brian repeatedly tells Stewie, "It is not your fault," in an attempt to help him process his feelings about the relationship's failure. This counseling session reveals a more vulnerable side of Stewie that viewers rarely see. When Brian persists with his therapeutic approach, Stewie eventually breaks down and cries, admitting, "Why is it so hard? I did not know it was going to be so hard." This moment of genuine emotion shows that underneath all his bravado and intelligence, Stewie is still just a child trying to navigate feelings and experiences that are beyond his emotional maturity. Brian's attempt to help Stewie process his emotions is actually quite touching, showing the depth of their friendship and Brian's genuine care for Stewie's well-being. However, this emotional support comes too late to prevent what happens next, and may actually contribute to Stewie's sense that he needs to take dramatic action to resolve his situation. After receiving Brian's encouragement to give the relationship another chance, Stewie returns to their playhouse to apologize to Olivia and try to work things out. He is prepared to take responsibility for his part in their problems and make a genuine effort to save their marriage. This shows real emotional growth for Stewie, demonstrating that he is capable of self-reflection and the desire to make amends. However, when Stewie arrives at the playhouse, he discovers what he perceives as the ultimate betrayal. Olivia is playing with silly putty with her friend Victor, and Stewie immediately interprets this innocent activity as cheating. This misunderstanding reveals how Stewie's possessiveness and jealousy have completely distorted his perception of normal social interactions. The fact that Olivia is simply playing with a friend, engaging in the kind of innocent childhood activity that should be completely normal and acceptable, shows how unreasonable Stewie's expectations have become. His reaction demonstrates that he views Olivia as his exclusive property rather than as an individual person with the right to have other friendships and interests. Upon discovering Olivia playing with Victor, Stewie does not confront them, demand an explanation, or even try to understand what is actually happening. Instead, he immediately decides that the relationship is over and that drastic action is required. This snap decision reveals how Stewie's mind works when he feels betrayed. He moves directly from hurt feelings to thoughts of revenge without considering any middle ground. He leaves the playhouse with a seemingly calm demeanor, but his next actions reveal the violent thoughts churning beneath the surface. Rather than simply walking away from the relationship or trying to work through his feelings, Stewie makes a conscious decision to commit an act of horrific violence. What makes this moment particularly disturbing is how calculated Stewie's response is. He does not act in a moment of blind rage or temporary insanity. Instead, he takes the time to leave the playhouse, obtain the materials needed to start a fire, and then return to carry out his plan. This premeditation shows that Stewie's violent action is not an emotional outburst, but a deliberate choice. Stewie's method of revenge is as shocking as it is methodical. He sets fire to the cardboard playhouse while Olivia and Victor are still inside, effectively attempting to murder both children. He declares it an idea for a farce, cheating wife and pompous man burned alive, while laughing maniacally. The choice to use fire as his weapon is particularly disturbing because of how painful and terrifying it would be for his victims. Unlike some of Stewie's other violent acts that might be quick or clean, burning someone alive represents prolonged suffering and agony. The fact that Stewie not only chooses this method, but seems to take pleasure in imagining his victim's pain, reveals the truly sadistic nature of his personality. The arson also represents a complete destruction of everything Stewie and Olivia had built together. The playhouse was not just where he discovered her betrayal. It was also the site of their marriage ceremony, their shared meals, and many of their happy moments together. By burning it down with them inside, Stewie is symbolically destroying all the good memories, along with the people who created them. After committing what amounts to attempted double murder, Stewie shows no signs of guilt, regret, or even concern about whether his victims survived. Instead, he uses the experience as a learning opportunity, telling Brian that he has discovered that being a grown-up is miserable and that women are a royal pain. This reaction is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire incident. Rather than recognizing that he nearly killed two people in a fit of jealous rage, Stewie treats the whole experience as just another failed experiment in adult relationships. He shows no empathy for his victims, no understanding of the severity of his actions, and no indication that he would behave differently in similar circumstances. The conversation with Brian that follows the arson attack reveals how completely Stewie has rationalized his violent behavior. He does not see himself as someone who just committed a horrific crime, but rather as someone who learned an important lesson about the challenges of romantic relationships. This ability to reframe his most violent impulses as educational experiences shows the sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms that allow Stewie to maintain his self-image despite his actions. The episode ends with Stewie asking Brian why men do not just live together and do what you would do with women, but with your buddy. When Brian explains that this is called being gay, Stewie responds with interest, saying he could totally get into that. While this might seem like a lighter moment after the violence, it actually reinforces how casually Stewie processes even major life revelations. This conversation is significant because it shows how Stewie's violent experience with heterosexual relationships does not lead him to examine his capacity for violence or possessiveness. Instead, he simply considers switching to a different type of relationship, as if changing the gender of his partner would solve the underlying psychological issues that led to his violent behavior. The casualness with which Stewie considers this major aspect of identity also demonstrates his tendency to treat complex human experiences as intellectual exercises rather than emotional realities. He approaches the possibility of being gay the same way he might approach a new scientific experiment, with curiosity, but without full understanding of the implications. The chick cancer episode represents one of the clearest examples of how dangerous Stewie can be when his emotions are involved. Unlike his schemes for world domination or his plots against Lois, which are often portrayed as somewhat cartoonish or theoretical, his violence against Olivia and Victor feels immediate and personal. The fact that he is willing to murder children, peers who should be his natural allies and companions, shows that no one is safe from his wrath when he feels wronged. This incident also highlights how Stewie's intelligence and technological capabilities make him far more dangerous than a typical jealous partner. Most children who feel betrayed in relationships might cry, throw tantrums, or break toys, but Stewie has the knowledge and resources to commit acts of violence that could actually kill people. His advanced cognitive abilities, combined with his emotional immaturity, create a uniquely dangerous combination. The episode serves as a dark commentary on how toxic relationship patterns can develop and escalate. Stewie's progression from love to possessiveness to violence follows a pattern that mirrors real-world abusive scenarios, but compressed into the timeline of a children's relationship. This compression makes the violence more shocking, while also highlighting how quickly healthy relationships can become dangerous when one partner becomes controlling and possessive. In short, in Chick Cancer, Stewie's reunion with child actress Olivia Fuller leads to a toxic relationship marked by constant fighting and possessiveness. After learning misguided relationship advice from observing Quagmire, Stewie becomes increasingly controlling and jealous. When he discovers Olivia innocently playing with her friend Victor, he interprets this as cheating and responds by setting their playhouse on fire with both children inside. His complete lack of remorse afterward, treating the attempted double murder as simply a learning experience about relationships, demonstrates the truly sociopathic nature of his personality. Take a moment to subscribe before we continue, if this is holding your attention. Moving on to Send in Stewie, Please, and the time Stewie let Dr. Pritchfield die from a heart attack. Send in Stewie, Please stands as one of Family Guy's darkest episodes, not because of explosive violence or elaborate schemes, but because of a quiet, calculated act of evil that reveals the true depths of Stewie's psychological disturbance. The episode begins with what seems like a routine disciplinary matter. Stewie has pushed a classmate named Tyler down the stairs at school, prompting the administration to require a session with a child psychologist. This incident with Tyler is not presented as particularly serious or unusual by Family Guy standards. School conflicts between children happen regularly, and pushing someone downstairs, while certainly wrong, might normally be handled with detention or a parent conference. However, the school's decision to mandate psychological evaluation suggests that there may be concerning patterns in Stewie's behavior that extend beyond this single incident. The choice of Dr. Cecil Pritchfield as Stewie's therapist proves to be crucial to everything that follows. Dr. Pritchfield is not just any child psychologist. He is portrayed as an exceptionally skilled and perceptive professional, voiced by the distinguished actor Ian McKellen. This casting choice immediately signals that the episode will be treating the therapy session with unusual seriousness and depth. What makes Send in Stewie, Please unique in Family Guy's catalog is its complete departure from the show's typical structure. This episode contains no cutaway gags, no appearances by Peter Griffin, and no random musical numbers or pop culture parodies. Instead, it focuses entirely on the conversation between Stewie and Dr. Pritchfield, creating an intimate character study that feels more like a serious drama than the usual Family Guy comedy. This format choice was bold and risky for a show known for its rapid-fire jokes and chaotic storytelling. By stripping away all the usual distractions and focusing solely on dialogue between two characters, the episode forces viewers to confront Stewie's psychology in a way that is rarely possible in the show's normal format. There is nowhere to hide from the uncomfortable truths that emerge during their conversation. The decision to make this a bottle episode, essentially taking place in a single location with minimal characters, also creates a sense of claustrophobia and intensity. Both Stewie and the audience are trapped in this therapy session, unable to escape to lighter moments or comedic relief. This creates the perfect conditions for the psychological manipulation and eventual tragedy that unfold. From their first moments together, Dr. Pritchfield demonstrates an unusual ability to see through Stewie's carefully constructed defenses. While most adults in Family Guy either cannot understand Stewie's speech or dismiss him as just a baby, Dr. Pritchfield immediately recognizes that he is dealing with an exceptionally intelligent and complex individual. This recognition both thrills and terrifies Stewie, who has never encountered an adult who truly sees him for who he is. Dr. Pritchfield makes astute observations about Stewie's character, most notably when he identifies Stewie as a very lonely little boy. This simple statement cuts through all of Stewie's intellectual pretensions and sophisticated vocabulary to reach the emotional truth at his core. Despite his advanced intelligence and elaborate schemes, Stewie is fundamentally an isolated child desperately seeking connection and understanding. Dr. Pritchfield's ability to see Stewie's loneliness is particularly significant because it represents exactly what Stewie has been seeking throughout the entire series. Behind all his plots for world domination and his sophisticated conversations with Brian, Stewie has always been searching for someone who would recognize his intelligence while also understanding his emotional needs. Dr. Pritchfield becomes the first adult to offer this combination of intellectual respect and emotional insight. When Dr. Pritchfield identifies his loneliness, Stewie's reaction is immediate and overwhelming. He breaks down in tears, crying, "Oh my God, I'm so lonely. You can see inside my soul." This moment represents the first time in the series that Stewie allows himself to be completely vulnerable with another person, dropping all pretense and acknowledging his deepest emotional pain. This breakdown is remarkable because it shows that underneath all his violence and scheming, Stewie is capable of genuine self-awareness and emotional honesty. He recognizes the truth in Dr. Pritchfield's observation and does not try to deflect or deny it. Instead, he embraces this moment of connection, even though it means admitting to feelings that contradict his carefully maintained image as a superior and self-sufficient individual. The tears that Stewie sheds during this moment are not the frustrated tears of a thwarted villain or the angry tears of someone whose plans have been disrupted. These are tears of relief and recognition, the tears of someone who has finally been seen and understood by another person. This makes what happens later in the episode even more tragic and disturbing. Perhaps the most shocking revelation of the therapy session comes when Stewie admits that his sophisticated British accent is completely fake. He tells Dr. Pritchfield that everything about him is a carefully constructed persona designed to keep people at arm's length, that this is not even how he really talks. He then speaks in what he claims is his natural American accent. This revelation recontextualizes everything viewers thought they knew about Stewie's character. His distinctive voice, which has been one of his most recognizable features since the series began, turns out to be nothing more than an elaborate defense mechanism. The accent serves as a coat of armor to get him through the day, just an image he cultivated so he can feel special. However, when Dr. Pritchfield says he does not hear a difference between Stewie's accents, Stewie demonstrates several other voices, Peter's, Quagmire's, and others. Dr. Pritchfield's response that they all sound like the same person suggests that the accent revelation might be part of Stewie's psychological defenses rather than literal truth. This ambiguity adds another layer to Stewie's complex relationship with identity and authenticity. During their session, Stewie also addresses questions about his sexuality, specifically in relation to his reason for pushing Tyler down the stairs. He explains that he only pushed Tyler down the stairs because he likes him and is afraid he will not like him back. He then quickly clarifies that he does not mean like him, and insists he is not gay. This conversation reveals the confusion and anxiety that Stewie feels about his own identity and attractions. His defensive insistence that these are questions he has been grappling with internally and the fact that he brings up sexuality without being directly asked about it indicates that it is a source of significant concern for him. Stewie's handling of these identity questions shows both his intellectual sophistication and his emotional immaturity. He can engage with complex concepts about sexuality and identity, but he approaches them with the anxiety and confusion typical of someone much younger than his apparent intellectual age. This disconnect between his cognitive abilities and emotional development becomes a recurring theme throughout the session. As the session progresses, Dr. Pritchfield successfully breaks through more of Stewie's psychological barriers, encouraging him to consider healthier ways of relating to others. Stewie becomes excited about the possibility of making genuine connections, declaring, "I'm going to talk to Tyler, I'm going to make friends, I'm going to be a normal boy." This moment represents a potential turning point for Stewie's character. For the first time, he is genuinely considering abandoning his pose of superiority and isolation in favor of authentic relationships with his peers. Dr. Pritchfield's therapeutic intervention appears to be working, offering hope that Stewie might be able to develop healthier social and emotional patterns. However, Dr. Pritchfield makes a crucial error when he responds to Stewie's enthusiasm by saying, "You're finally going to be just like everybody else." While this comment is meant to be encouraging, it triggers an immediate negative reaction from Stewie, who asks him to repeat the phrase with growing alarm. When Dr. Pritchfield repeats it, Stewie's entire demeanor changes. He reverts to his British accent as he protests, "But I don't want to be like everybody else." This reaction reveals that despite his loneliness and desire for connection, Stewie's sense of superiority is too deeply ingrained to abandon completely. This moment highlights the fundamental tension at the core of Stewie's psychology. He desperately wants to be understood and accepted, but he also needs to feel special and superior to others. Dr. Pritchfield's suggestion that therapy success means becoming like everybody else directly threatens Stewie's core identity as an exceptional individual who stands above the common masses. The therapeutic breakthrough that seemed so promising just moments before collapses entirely as Stewie realizes that true emotional health might require giving up the very thing that makes him feel valuable: his sense of being different and superior. This internal conflict between his need for connection and his need for specialness ultimately proves impossible for him to resolve in a healthy way. At this crucial moment in their session, Dr. Pritchfield suffers a heart attack. The timing of this medical emergency is particularly tragic because it occurs just as Stewie is grappling with the most important psychological insights of his life. Rather than random chance, the heart attack feels like a cruel interruption of what could have been genuine healing and growth. Dr. Pritchfield's life is in immediate danger, and Stewie has the opportunity to call for help or provide assistance. This becomes a moment of moral choice for Stewie. He can act to save the life of someone who has just offered him profound understanding and a therapeutic breakthrough, or he can choose to let Dr. Pritchfield die. What makes this choice particularly significant is that it occurs in the immediate aftermath of their therapeutic breakthrough. Dr. Pritchfield has just demonstrated exactly the kind of understanding and insight that Stewie has been seeking his entire life. A person motivated by gratitude, affection, or basic human decency would naturally want to save someone who had just provided such valuable help. Stewie's decision to let Dr. Pritchfield die is not made in a moment of panic or confusion. Stewie makes a conscious choice not to help, and his reasoning is chillingly practical. Dr. Pritchfield knows too much about him. The therapist has seen through all of Stewie's defenses and psychological armor, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable. This decision reveals the true depth of Stewie's psychological disturbance. Rather than treasuring the connection he has found with someone who truly understands him, he views that understanding as a threat that must be eliminated. His need for control and secrecy outweighs any gratitude he might feel towards someone who has just provided him with invaluable emotional insight. The choice to let Dr. Pritchfield die also demonstrates how Stewie's intelligence can be directed toward evil purposes. He is smart enough to recognize that Dr. Pritchfield's death will eliminate the threat of exposure while also ending the uncomfortable psychological pressure to change and grow. In Stewie's calculation, this becomes the most efficient solution to his emotional discomfort. After Dr. Pritchfield dies, Stewie shows no signs of guilt, grief, or regret about his decision. Even the therapist's personal life is falling apart at the moment of his death. His partner Michael calls to ask for a divorce just after he dies. Stewie's only response to this additional tragedy is the callous observation, "This is not your day." This casual dismissal of both Dr. Pritchfield's death and the dissolution of his relationship reveals how completely Stewie compartmentalizes his emotions. He does not see Dr. Pritchfield as a real person who had hopes, fears, relationships, and a full life that has now been cut short. Instead, he views him merely as a problem that has been solved through elimination. Stewie's lack of emotional response to the death also suggests that his breakthrough during therapy may have been less genuine than it initially appeared. If he were truly capable of the empathy and emotional growth that Dr. Pritchfield was encouraging, he would feel some level of remorse about letting his therapist die. His complete absence of guilt indicates that his capacity for emotional connection may be more limited than even Dr. Pritchfield realized. Following Dr. Pritchfield's death, Stewie returns home and continues his normal life as if nothing significant has happened. He does not tell Brian or anyone else about what occurred during the therapy session or about his role in Dr. Pritchfield's death. This ability to compartmentalize and maintain normalcy after committing what amounts to murder demonstrates the sophisticated psychological defenses that allow Stewie to function despite his violent actions. Stewie does eventually confide in Brian that he did something bad during the therapy session, but he refuses to provide details about what happened. This partial confession suggests that some part of Stewie recognizes the moral weight of his actions, even if he does not feel genuine remorse. However, his unwillingness to fully confess indicates that he is not prepared to face the consequences of his choice. Brian's response to Stewie's distress, sleeping beside him for comfort, shows the genuine affection and care that exists in their relationship. Brian recognizes that Stewie is troubled and offers emotional support without demanding explanations or judging him for his secretiveness. This compassionate response highlights the contrast between Brian's capacity for unconditional love and Stewie's calculating approach to relationships. The events of Send in Stewie, Please represent a fundamental revelation about Stewie's psychological makeup. Previous episodes had shown him capable of violence and manipulation, but this episode demonstrates that his capacity for evil extends even to people who genuinely care about him and offer him exactly what he claims to want: understanding, acceptance, and emotional connection. Dr. Pritchfield's death also eliminates Stewie's best chance for genuine psychological growth and healing. The therapist had successfully identified the core issues underlying Stewie's antisocial behavior and was beginning to help him develop healthier coping mechanisms. By choosing to eliminate this source of help, Stewie essentially chooses to remain trapped in his current psychological patterns rather than risking the vulnerability that comes with genuine change. The episode also reveals the limits of therapy and professional intervention when dealing with someone who fundamentally lacks empathy and moral reasoning. Dr. Pritchfield's skills and insights were exceptional, but they could not overcome Stewie's basic unwillingness to value other people's lives and well-being. This suggests that Stewie's psychological problems may be too deeply rooted to be addressed through conventional therapeutic approaches. Send in Stewie, Please stands apart from other Family Guy episodes, not just because of its serious tone and psychological depth, but because it forces viewers to confront the reality of what Stewie actually is: not a lovable villain or harmless schemer, but a genuine sociopath capable of calculated murder. The episode strips away the comedy and cartoon violence that usually surrounds Stewie's actions to show the true horror of his psychological makeup. The episode's impact is heightened by Ian McKellen's exceptional performance as Dr. Pritchfield, which brings real gravitas and emotional weight to the therapeutic scenes. His portrayal of a skilled, compassionate professional trying to help a deeply troubled child makes Stewie's ultimate betrayal even more shocking and tragic. The decision to end the episode with Dr. Pritchfield's death also represents a rare instance of permanent consequences in Family Guy's universe. Unlike most of the show's violence and chaos, which gets reset by the next episode, Dr. Pritchfield's death has lasting impact and meaning. This permanence forces viewers to grapple with the reality of Stewie's actions, rather than dismissing them as cartoon comedy. In short, in Send in Stewie, Please, Stewie undergoes a mandatory therapy session with Dr. Cecil Pritchfield after pushing a classmate down the stairs. Dr. Pritchfield proves exceptionally skilled at seeing through Stewie's psychological defenses, identifying his deep loneliness, and encouraging genuine emotional growth. During their breakthrough session, Stewie reveals that his British accent is fake and admits his desperate need for connection. However, when Dr. Pritchfield suggests that healing means becoming like everybody else, Stewie rejects this path. When the therapist suffers a heart attack during their session, Stewie deliberately chooses not to help, allowing Dr. Pritchfield to die because he knows too much about Stewie's true nature. This calculated murder of someone who genuinely cared about him represents one of Stewie's darkest acts, showing his complete inability to value human life, even when it belongs to someone trying to help him. Do subscribe before the next one if this is landing for you. Moving on to The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair and the time Stewie created an evil clone of himself. This episode represents one of Stewie Griffin's most disturbing outings, not because of what he intentionally sets out to do, but because of what he accidentally creates in his attempt to reclaim his evil nature. The episode begins with what appears to be a simple day at the beach, where Stewie has constructed an elaborate sand replica of the Raytheon executive headquarters in El Segundo, California. This impressive feat of engineering demonstrates Stewie's continued intellectual capabilities and attention to detail. However, this moment of pride quickly turns to humiliation when a local boy kicks down Stewie's sand creation and mocks him for his efforts. The boy's casual destruction of hours of work, combined with his dismissive attitude towards Stewie, represents exactly the kind of disrespect that would once have triggered an immediate and violent response from the baby genius. In earlier seasons, such an insult would have resulted in elaborate revenge schemes, or at least threatening behavior. Instead of responding with his typical fury and threats of violence, Stewie attempts to handle the situation through conventional means. He politely approaches the boy, tries to make conversation, and begins assembling what appears to be a rifle to deal with the threat. However, his weapon falls apart before he can use it, and the boy simply walks away, laughing at Stewie's failure. This moment of mechanical incompetence, combined with his inability to inspire fear, leaves Stewie feeling confused and diminished. The failure with the rifle prompts Brian to make an observation that cuts to the heart of Stewie's current psychological state. Brian tells Stewie that he thinks he is going soft and points out that it has been a long time since Stewie has tried to blow something up or take over the world or even use the phrase, "damn you." This assessment forces Stewie to confront the possibility that he is losing the very qualities that have defined his identity since the series began. Brian's observation is particularly significant because it comes from someone who knows Stewie better than almost anyone else. As his closest friend and frequent companion on adventures, Brian has witnessed Stewie's evolution from a purely evil character focused on matricide and world domination to someone more concerned with typical childhood activities. While this character development might be seen as positive growth in most contexts, for Stewie it represents a fundamental threat to his sense of self. The timing of Brian's criticism is also important because it comes at a moment when Stewie is already feeling vulnerable due to his public humiliation. Rather than offering comfort or support, Brian essentially confirms Stewie's worst fears about himself, that he is becoming ordinary, weak, and unremarkable. This psychological pressure creates the perfect conditions for Stewie to take drastic action to prove that his evil nature remains intact. When confronted with Brian's assessment, Stewie initially tries to defend his recent behavior by explaining that he has legitimate reasons for being distracted. He tells Brian that he has a lot on his plate, that he is learning to use the toilet, learning what shapes are, and that he spent half an hour laughing at his own feet the day before. This response reveals the fundamental tension between Stewie's advanced intellectual capabilities and his physical reality as a one-year-old child. Stewie's explanation highlights how his daily life involves mastering basic childhood milestones that most people take for granted. Learning to use the toilet, understanding geometric shapes, and being fascinated by his own body parts are all normal developmental activities for someone his apparent age. However, for someone with Stewie's sophisticated vocabulary and complex schemes, these mundane activities feel beneath his intellectual level and inconsistent with his self-image as a superior being. The fact that Stewie feels compelled to justify his recent behavior shows how deeply Brian's criticism has affected him. Rather than dismissing Brian's concerns or confidently asserting his continued evil nature, Stewie seems genuinely worried that he might be losing the qualities that make him special and feared. This vulnerability and self-doubt create the psychological pressure that drives him toward increasingly desperate measures. Unable to accept the possibility that he is becoming soft or ordinary, Stewie decides to take active measures to enhance his evil nature and prove that he remains a formidable force. This decision represents a fascinating example of how self-consciousness about one's identity can lead to overcompensation and dangerous behavior. Rather than accepting that personal growth and change might be natural and positive, Stewie views any movement away from pure evil as a weakness that must be corrected. The concept of artificially enhancing one's personality traits through scientific means is classic Stewie behavior, combining his advanced technological capabilities with his psychological insecurities. Rather than working through his feelings about his changing nature or accepting that evolution might be healthy, he approaches the problem like a technical challenge that can be solved through proper application of science and engineering. This technological approach to psychological problems also reflects Stewie's tendency to treat complex human experiences as intellectual puzzles rather than emotional realities. He does not consider therapy, self-reflection, or conversations with friends as potential solutions to his identity crisis. Instead, he immediately turns to invention and experimentation, treating his personality as something that can be adjusted and optimized like a machine. Stewie's attempt to scientifically enhance his evil nature goes catastrophically wrong when he accidentally creates a perfect clone of himself, but one that embodies all of his darkest impulses without any of the restraining influences that have developed over the years. Evil Stewie represents everything that original Stewie used to be, amplified and freed from any moral considerations or emotional attachments that might limit his destructive potential. The creation of evil Stewie serves as a dark mirror that shows original Stewie exactly what he used to be like, and, by extension, what he is afraid of losing. Evil Stewie possesses all of original Stewie's intelligence and technological capabilities, but none of his growth, friendship with Brian, or developing capacity for genuine emotion. This clone represents pure malevolence, untempered by any humanizing influences. The existence of evil Stewie also forces original Stewie to confront the reality of what his evil nature actually meant in practical terms. When separated from his personality and embodied in a separate individual, Stewie's evil traits become genuinely terrifying rather than darkly amusing. This external perspective allows both Stewie and the audience to see the true horror of unrestrained malevolence. Once unleashed, evil Stewie immediately begins a campaign of violence and destruction throughout Quahog that far exceeds anything original Stewie has ever attempted. The episode depicts evil Stewie engaging in brutal murders of innocent citizens, demonstrating a complete lack of empathy or moral restraint. Unlike original Stewie's schemes, which often had specific targets or goals, evil Stewie's violence appears random and motivated purely by sadistic pleasure. One of the most disturbing aspects of evil Stewie's rampage is his encounter with the Kool-Aid Man. Evil Stewie actually drinks the Kool-Aid Man's contents, effectively murdering this beloved advertising character in a grotesque manner. This act demonstrates not only evil Stewie's capacity for violence, but also his complete disregard for any boundaries or taboos that might limit normal behavior. The random nature of evil Stewie's violence makes it particularly frightening because it shows what unchecked evil actually looks like when freed from any rational limitations. Original Stewie's plots, while often violent, typically had logical motivations and specific objectives. Evil Stewie kills simply because he can, without needing justification or purpose beyond his own satisfaction. Perhaps the most personal and cruel aspect of evil Stewie's rampage is his treatment of Brian, who becomes a specific target for prolonged torture and humiliation. Brian is tied to a flagpole, waiting helplessly for evil Stewie to appear and end his suffering. This situation is particularly tragic because Brian is the one who initially criticized original Stewie for going soft, inadvertently triggering the chain of events that led to evil Stewie's creation. Brian's position as a victim of evil Stewie's cruelty serves multiple narrative purposes. It demonstrates the personal cost of original Stewie's psychological insecurities, showing how his attempt to prove his evil nature has endangered his closest friend. It also highlights the difference between original Stewie's relationship with Brian, which, despite its conflicts, is based on genuine affection, and evil Stewie's purely sadistic approach to interpersonal relationships. The fact that Brian eventually asks evil Stewie to end the torture rather than continue, it shows just how brutal and prolonged his suffering has been. As evil Stewie's rampage continues, original Stewie begins to realize the magnitude of what he has unleashed upon Quahog and the people he cares about. The clone's actions force him to confront the reality that his former evil nature, when taken to its logical extreme, results in senseless violence and cruelty that serves no constructive purpose. This realization represents a crucial moment of self-awareness for original Stewie. The horror that original Stewie feels watching his evil clone's actions suggests that his character development over the years has been more genuine and significant than he initially realized. His emotional response to evil Stewie's violence indicates that he has indeed developed empathy, moral reasoning, and genuine care for others, qualities that he was afraid of losing, but that actually represent positive growth rather than weakness. Original Stewie's decision to intervene and stop evil Stewie demonstrates that his capacity for good has become stronger than his attachment to his evil identity. Rather than celebrating the clone's success in proving that evil Stewie still exists within him, he recognizes that such unrestrained malevolence is destructive and wrong. This moral clarity represents significant character development. The final confrontation between original Stewie and evil Stewie becomes a battle for the soul of Stewie's identity. Both versions represent different aspects of his personality, one showing who he used to be and still fears losing, the other showing who he has become and might continue to grow into. The physical fight between them symbolizes the internal struggle that has been driving Stewie's psychological crisis throughout the episode. The fact that the two Stewies are physically identical creates a practical problem for Brian, who must determine which one to save and which one to eliminate. This scenario forces all three characters to confront what truly defines identity. Is it physical appearance, shared memories, or fundamental moral character? Brian resolves this dilemma through a test that reveals the essential difference between the two Stewies. When Brian asks both Stewies to look at their feet, original Stewie responds normally, while evil Stewie giggles and asks, "What are they doing down there?" "They're like leg hands." This response reveals that evil Stewie has retained the childlike wonder and innocence that Stewie was afraid of losing, but in a twisted form that coexists with pure malevolence. Original Stewie's normal response shows that he has integrated his development into a more balanced personality. Brian's decision to shoot evil Stewie represents more than just eliminating a threat. It is a clear statement about which version of Stewie he prefers and wants to preserve. By choosing to save original Stewie, Brian affirms that the character development and emotional growth that Stewie has undergone are valuable and worth protecting, even if they come at the cost of his supposedly defining evil nature. The method Brian uses to distinguish between the two Stewies is particularly significant because it is based on their capacity for innocent wonder rather than their intellectual capabilities or evil potential. Evil Stewie's childlike response to seeing his feet reveals that pure evil and pure innocence can coexist in disturbing ways, while original Stewie's balanced response shows healthy integration of different aspects of personality. Brian's relief after eliminating evil Stewie, combined with his gratitude that he did not kill the wrong Stewie, confirms that he values original Stewie's current personality over his former purely evil nature. This validation from his closest friend helps original Stewie understand that his character development represents growth rather than loss, and that maintaining some evil traits is not worth the cost of becoming genuinely monstrous. The episode ends with an ambiguous moment that calls into question whether Brian actually saved the right Stewie. After the confrontation, the surviving Stewie displays behavior that could be interpreted as either original Stewie's normal personality or evil Stewie's manipulation. This uncertainty creates lasting doubt about which version of Stewie actually survived and whether the threat has truly been eliminated. The ambiguous ending serves multiple purposes in the episode's narrative structure. It maintains tension and uncertainty about Stewie's true nature, suggesting that the capacity for evil remains present even in his more developed personality. It also reflects the reality that personal growth and character development are ongoing processes rather than permanent achievements, and that the potential for regression always exists. This uncertainty also mirrors real-world psychology, where the line between healthy personal development and concerning personality changes is not always clear. The episode suggests that the integration of different aspects of personality, including potentially dark impulses, is more complex than simply choosing between good and evil versions of oneself. The hand that rocks the wheelchair serves as a meta-commentary on Stewie's character development throughout the Family Guy series. The episode acknowledges that Stewie has indeed changed from his early appearances, becoming less focused on matricide and world domination, and more involved in typical childhood activities and genuine relationships. However, it questions whether this change represents growth or loss of identity. The episode suggests that character development in long-running series creates genuine challenges for both creators and audiences. Characters who change too much risk losing what made them distinctive and beloved, while characters who remain static risk becoming stale and irrelevant. Stewie's identity crisis reflects the broader challenge of maintaining character consistency while allowing for growth and evolution. The creation and destruction of evil Stewie can be read as the show's way of having its cake and eating it too, demonstrating that pure evil Stewie still exists as a possibility while affirming that his current, more complex personality is preferable and worth preserving. This allows the character to maintain his edge while acknowledging his emotional development. In short, in the hand that rocks the wheelchair, Stewie's insecurity about losing his evil edge leads him to accidentally create an evil clone of himself during a failed attempt at self-enhancement. Evil Stewie embodies all of original Stewie's worst traits without any restraining influences, going on a murderous rampage through Quahog that includes drinking the Kool-Aid Man's contents and torturing Brian. When original Stewie realizes the horror he has unleashed, he teams up with Brian to stop his evil clone. The episode ends ambiguously, with uncertainty about which Stewie actually survived, reflecting the ongoing tension between character development and maintaining core identity traits. Before we move on, subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Road to the North Pole and its Christmas home invasion violence. This episode begins as what should be a typical Christmas story, but quickly transforms into one of Family Guy's darkest adventures. It starts with Stewie and Brian waiting in line to see the Mall Santa, a normal holiday activity that countless families participate in every year. However, this innocent beginning sets the stage for a series of increasingly disturbing events that reveal the true horror lurking beneath Christmas traditions. The first sign that something is wrong comes when Stewie becomes impatient with the long line and notices that there are black teenagers working at what is supposed to be the North Pole. When Brian awkwardly suggests they might be from Katrina, it becomes clear that the mall's Christmas setup is far from the magical wonderland it is supposed to represent. This initial disconnect between Christmas fantasy and reality foreshadows the much darker truths that Stewie and Brian will discover later. Stewie's interaction with the Mall Santa proves to be the catalyst for everything that follows. Rather than the jolly, magical figure that children expect to meet, the Mall Santa turns out to be rude and dismissive toward Stewie. This negative encounter shatters Stewie's expectations about Christmas and Santa Claus, leading him to make a decision that will have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Following his disappointing experience with the Mall Santa, Stewie makes what might be his most ambitious and disturbing plan yet. He decides to travel to the actual North Pole and murder the real Santa Claus. This decision represents a fundamental escalation in Stewie's violent tendencies, moving from personal grievances against family members to attacking a beloved figure who brings joy to children around the world. Stewie declares his intention to Brian with characteristic determination, telling him to do what he wants, but that Stewie is going to the North Pole and is going to kill that man. This statement reveals how completely Stewie's disappointment has transformed into murderous rage. Rather than simply accepting that his mall experience was less than ideal, he immediately jumps to the most extreme possible response. Stewie's plan to kill Santa Claus also demonstrates his complete inability to understand proportional responses to disappointment. Most children who have negative experiences with mall Santas might be upset or cry, but they do not typically plan elaborate murder schemes. Stewie's reaction shows how his advanced intelligence, when combined with his emotional immaturity, leads to solutions that are both sophisticated and completely inappropriate. When Brian realizes the seriousness of Stewie's intentions, he attempts to talk him out of the plan by revealing that Santa Claus does not actually exist. This seems like a reasonable approach. If Santa is not real, then Stewie cannot kill him, and the whole scheme becomes impossible. However, Brian's logical intervention completely backfires due to Stewie's unique worldview and understanding of reality. Stewie responds by mockingly asking, "Who else is not real?" wondering aloud whether Brian is going to tell him that Elmo or SpongeBob is not real either. This response reveals that Stewie operates with a completely different understanding of what constitutes a real versus a fictional character. Stewie's logic, while flawed by adult standards, makes perfect sense from his perspective. He lives in a world where cartoon physics apply, where he can build time machines and weapons far beyond current technology, and where he regularly has conversations with his family dog. In this context, the distinction between real and fictional characters becomes meaningless. If SpongeBob and Elmo can exist in his world, then so can Santa Claus. Despite Brian's attempts to dissuade him, Stewie remains committed to his plan, and the two begin their journey toward the North Pole. Their travel experiences provide dark comedy while also highlighting the cultural ignorance and privilege that both characters display. The encounter with a helpful Canadian stranger becomes a series of misunderstandings that reveal both Stewie's limited worldview and the show's willingness to mine humor from miscommunication. There is an extended conversation where Stewie confuses AAA, the automobile service, with AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, leading to a frustrating exchange that highlights how different backgrounds and experiences can create communication barriers. While this scene provides comic relief, it also shows how Stewie's privileged upbringing has left him unprepared for real-world interactions with people from different backgrounds. The Canadian's extraordinary generosity, offering his snowmobile, money, and even his leg to help strangers, provides a stark contrast to Stewie's murderous intentions. This juxtaposition highlights the fundamental difference between someone motivated by kindness and community spirit versus someone driven by selfish rage and violent impulses. When Stewie and Brian finally reach what they believe to be the North Pole, they discover a truth far more disturbing than either of them expected. Rather than finding a non-existent Santa or even a pleasant Christmas village, they encounter a nightmare version of the North Pole that operates more like a hellish sweatshop than a magical workshop. The real Santa Claus turns out to be a broken, exhausted man on the verge of death from overwork and stress. Santa explains the impossible demands placed on him by modern consumer culture, lamenting that they used to make wooden toys and rag dolls, and asking how anyone is supposed to make an iPod when he has orders for millions of them. This revelation transforms Santa from a magical figure into a victim of capitalism and consumer excess, forced to meet impossible production demands with inadequate resources. The working conditions at the North Pole are revealed to be absolutely horrific. The elves have been forced to inbreed to supply more workers, resulting in horrible mutations that make them barely recognizable as the cheerful helpers of Christmas legend. The reindeer have become feral, carnivorous monsters rather than the gentle, flying animals that children imagine. This dystopian version of Christmas represents everything wrong with how modern society has commercialized and corrupted what should be a season of joy and giving. Faced with Santa's desperate condition and the revelation that Christmas is essentially a failed system, Stewie and Brian make the well-intentioned but ultimately disastrous decision to take over Santa's duties themselves. This choice represents a rare moment where Stewie attempts to do something genuinely helpful rather than pursuing his own selfish interests. However, their complete lack of understanding about how Christmas actually works leads to consequences far worse than anything they intended. Their attempt to deliver presents begins badly and quickly spirals into complete disaster. Without proper preparation, understanding of the logistics involved, or any real comprehension of what Christmas means to families around the world, Stewie and Brian find themselves completely overwhelmed by the task they have undertaken. Their failure is not just inconvenient, it actively damages the Christmas experience for countless families. The decision to play Santa also reveals the fundamental arrogance that drives both characters. Despite having no experience with Christmas deliveries, no knowledge of children's wishes, and no understanding of family dynamics, they assume they can simply step in and perform a job that has supposedly been refined over centuries. This overconfidence sets the stage for the violence that follows. The darkest moment of the episode occurs when Stewie and Brian attempt to deliver presents to a family's home, and everything goes catastrophically wrong. They enter through a window and are discovered by the homeowner, Dan, who naturally assumes they are burglars and threatens to call the police. This confrontation escalates quickly when Brian attempts to explain their presence with an obviously false story about being Santa Claus. When Dan does not believe their explanation and continues to threaten calling the authorities, Stewie responds with immediate and brutal violence. Stewie beats Dan with a baseball bat, knocking him unconscious. This assault represents a shocking escalation from their Christmas mission to actual home invasion and assault with a deadly weapon. What makes this violence particularly disturbing is how casually Stewie commits it and how he justifies it afterward. When Brian expresses horror at what Stewie has done, Stewie simply explains that Dan was going to call the police, and you cannot call the police on Santa. This response shows that Stewie has completely lost touch with reality, believing that their fake Santa persona somehow justifies violent assault against innocent people. The situation becomes even more horrific when Stewie and Brian realize they have invaded the wrong house entirely. Their growing confusion as they try to understand why the house does not match their expectations leads to the devastating realization that they are in the wrong house. This means that they have brutally assaulted an innocent man and traumatized his child for absolutely no reason. The fact that they attacked the wrong family makes their crime exponentially worse because it demonstrates the complete randomness and senselessness of their violence. Dan and his daughter were not even supposed to be their targets. They were simply innocent victims who happened to be in a house that Stewie and Brian mistakenly entered. This random victimization makes their assault feel more like a home invasion committed by dangerous criminals than a misguided Christmas mission. The presence of a child witness to this violence adds another layer of trauma and horror to the situation. Not only has this little girl watched her father being beaten unconscious by strangers, but she has also been forced to participate in Stewie and Brian's delusional fantasy about being Santa Claus. The psychological damage from witnessing such violence during what should be a magical time of year could affect her relationship with Christmas for the rest of her life. Following their assault on Dan, Stewie and Brian engage in behavior that transforms them from misguided do-gooders into genuine criminals. Stewie tells Brian that is the last of the blood and to go check on the other kid, indicating that they have spent time cleaning up evidence of their violent crime rather than seeking medical help for their victim or turning themselves in to authorities. This cover-up behavior reveals that both characters understand the serious nature of what they have done, but rather than taking responsibility for their actions, they choose to hide the evidence and continue with their mission. This decision shows a complete lack of moral reasoning and empathy for their victims. They treat Dan's assault as merely an inconvenience to be cleaned up, rather than a serious crime with real consequences for real people. Later in the episode, Stewie and Brian encounter Quagmire and his young niece Abby while waiting to see another mall Santa. This interaction provides a stark contrast to their earlier violence, while also highlighting their complete inability to understand appropriate social behavior. When Brian mistakes Abby for a boy and makes assumptions about her appearance, the situation quickly becomes deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Abby is actually a young cancer patient whose hair loss is due to chemotherapy treatments, not a fashion choice or natural appearance. Brian's innocent mistake of calling her a little guy and asking if she has been a good boy inadvertently highlights her medical condition and gender in a way that clearly causes her emotional distress. Quagmire's angry response reveals the additional layer of tragedy in this situation. Abby is not just dealing with a serious medical condition, but also struggling with the social and emotional challenges that come with visible signs of illness during childhood. The situation with Abby becomes even worse when Brian attempts to apologize, but inadvertently makes things much more traumatic for the child. When he says he did not know she was dying, he introduces the concept of death into a conversation with a young cancer patient who may not have fully understood the potential severity of her condition. This thoughtless comment transforms an awkward social situation into a genuine psychological trauma. Abby immediately asks her uncle whether she is dying. This innocent question reveals that Brian's careless words have forced a young child to confront her own mortality in a way that her family had been trying to avoid. The fact that she turns to her uncle for reassurance shows her trust in the adults around her to protect her from frightening realities. Quagmire's response to the situation demonstrates both his love for his niece and his fury at Brian's insensitivity. He reassures Abby that she is not dying and promises that Santa will help her, while simultaneously ordering Brian to leave. This moment shows how Brian's social ignorance and inability to think before speaking can cause real harm to vulnerable people. The episode reveals a disturbing pattern in how Stewie and Brian's Christmas mission consistently results in harm to innocent people, particularly children. From their assault on Dan in front of his daughter, to their traumatizing of Abby with careless comments about death, their attempts to participate in Christmas traditions leave a trail of psychological and physical damage. This pattern suggests that both characters are fundamentally unsuited for the roles they have tried to assume. Their combination of good intentions and poor judgment, violent tendencies and social ignorance, creates a toxic mix that makes them dangerous to be around, especially for vulnerable populations like children and families. The episode also highlights how privilege and self-centeredness can blind people to the real impact of their actions on others. Both Stewie and Brian approach Christmas from their own perspectives and needs, without considering how their behavior affects the people around them. This narcissistic worldview allows them to justify increasingly harmful behavior as long as it serves their own goals. In short, in Road to the North Pole, Stewie's negative experience with a mall Santa leads him to plan the murder of the real Santa Claus, dragging Brian along on a journey to the North Pole. When they discover that Santa is actually a broken, dying man, overwhelmed by impossible consumer demands, they decide to take over his Christmas duties. Their incompetent attempt at delivering presents results in them breaking into the wrong house and brutally beating an innocent father with a baseball bat while his daughter watches, then covering up their crime. The episode shows how their good intentions, combined with violence, ignorance, and narcissism, create a trail of trauma for innocent victims, particularly children, transforming Christmas from a season of joy into a nightmare of violence and psychological damage. Take a second to subscribe before we continue if this is worth your while. Moving on, we have Brian Griffin's House of Pain and its severe head trauma and family neglect. This episode represents one of the most disturbing outings in Family Guy history, not because of intentional violence or elaborate schemes, but because of how a simple accident spirals into horrific neglect and cover-up attempts by the entire Griffin family. The episode begins with what should be typical sibling behavior: Chris sneaking into Meg's bedroom to read her diary, looking for embarrassing secrets to mock his sister about. Chris reads aloud from Meg's diary about her worsening headaches. This invasion of privacy represents normal, if inappropriate, sibling behavior that happens in many households. When Meg discovers Chris with her diary, she naturally tries to get it back, leading to a chase scene that seems harmless enough at first. However, this innocent sibling conflict becomes the catalyst for everything that follows. As Chris runs from Meg while keeping her diary away from her, he accidentally knocks Stewie down the stairs. This moment transforms what should be a minor family dispute into a serious medical emergency that will test every family member's moral character and reveal how spectacularly they all fail that test. When Chris and Meg realize that Stewie has been seriously injured in the fall, their first instinct is not to get help or tell their parents about the accident. Instead, they immediately begin discussing how to avoid getting in trouble for what happened. They ask each other whether he is okay, then argue about whose fault the accident was, rather than focusing on getting Stewie medical attention. This decision to prioritize avoiding blame over getting help for an injured baby reveals a fundamental dysfunction in how the Griffin children approach problems. Rather than understanding that accidents happen and that the important thing is making sure Stewie gets proper care, they immediately shift into self-preservation mode. This reaction suggests that they expect to be punished severely for any involvement in Stewie's injury, regardless of whether it was intentional. The fact that both children seem to automatically assume they need to hide what happened indicates that this is not the first time they have encountered situations where covering up problems seemed safer than being honest. This pattern of behavior suggests ongoing family dynamics where taking responsibility for accidents or mistakes is not handled in a healthy, supportive way. As the episode progresses, it becomes clear that Stewie's injuries are far more serious than a simple bump or bruise. He remains unconscious for an extended period, developing an increasingly severe head wound that attracts flies and eventually maggots. The description of his condition becomes progressively more disturbing as the family continues to avoid seeking proper medical care. Stewie's head injury develops into a massive gash that exposes his brain and produces a smell that Peter describes as brain smell. The presence of flies and maggots in the wound indicates that the injury has become seriously infected and potentially life-threatening. Yet, despite these obvious signs of medical emergency, the family continues their elaborate cover-up efforts. The graphic nature of Stewie's deteriorating condition serves to highlight just how irresponsible and dangerous the family's behavior has become. What started as an attempt to avoid getting in trouble for an accident has evolved into medical neglect that could easily result in permanent brain damage or death. When Peter eventually discovers what has happened to Stewie, his reaction reveals a deeply troubling approach to parenting and family safety. Rather than being horrified by his son's condition or rushing to get medical help, Peter actually praises Chris and Meg for their cover-up efforts. He tells Chris he has taught him well and that he has the right instincts. Peter goes on to explain his philosophy about handling situations where children are injured, casually admitting that when they were babies, he used to knock the kids out every month or so, sometimes by accident, sometimes when the Patriots lost, and that you just have to cover it up, and eventually it all works out. This casual admission reveals that Peter has a long history of injuring his children and teaching them to hide evidence of harm rather than seeking appropriate help. This revelation transforms the episode from a story about children making bad decisions into a narrative about systematic family dysfunction and possible child abuse. Peter's matter-of-fact discussion of regularly knocking his children unconscious suggests that violence and cover-ups are normal parts of the Griffin household dynamic. His pride in his children's cover-up abilities indicates that he values deception and self-preservation over honesty and child safety. Instead of taking Stewie to a hospital, the family embarks on increasingly elaborate and disturbing attempts to hide his condition from Lois and the outside world. They dress Stewie in various hats to cover his head wound and use makeup to paint fake eyeballs on his closed eyelids to make him appear awake and alert during family meals. These deception attempts grow more sophisticated and grotesque as Stewie's condition worsens. Peter creates a crude puppet system using coat hangers to make Stewie's arms move, while Chris provides voice acting to make it seem like Stewie is speaking normally, providing exaggerated lines in an attempt to maintain the illusion that everything is normal. The fact that these elaborate deceptions are necessary demonstrates just how serious Stewie's condition has become. A conscious, healthy baby would not need to be propped up, have fake eyes painted on, or require someone else to speak for them. Yet, the family continues these efforts rather than admitting what has happened and seeking appropriate medical care. The episode reaches new levels of disturbing imagery when the family's attempts to hide Stewie's condition using hats backfire spectacularly. When they place a coonskin cap on Stewie's head to cover his wound, it turns out to be a live raccoon that begins biting and pulling at Stewie's head. This incident adds additional trauma and injury to an already serious medical situation. Rather than treating this as the final straw that demands immediate medical intervention, Chris's reaction is to laugh and comment that they look like little robbers. This casual response to watching a wild animal attack his injured baby brother demonstrates how completely desensitized the family has become to Stewie's suffering and the severity of his condition. The raccoon attack also serves as a metaphor for how the family's cover-up efforts are actually making Stewie's situation worse rather than better. Every attempt to hide his injuries results in additional harm, yet they continue to prioritize deception over getting him proper care. This pattern shows how cover-ups often spiral out of control and create more problems than they solve. The episode's climax occurs when Peter realizes that their cover-up efforts are no longer sustainable and decides to create a new explanation for Stewie's injuries. In a moment of calculated cruelty, Peter throws the unconscious Stewie under Lois's car as she is backing out of the driveway, creating the appearance that she has accidentally run over her own baby. Lois's immediate reaction is horror and guilt, crying out and asking what she has done. This response demonstrates that Lois, unlike the rest of her family, has a normal emotional reaction to seeing a child injured. Her immediate distress and self-blame show that she still maintains basic human empathy and parental instincts. However, what happens next reveals how the Griffin family's dysfunction can corrupt even well-intentioned family members. Rather than maintaining her initial honest response, Lois quickly shifts into the same cover-up mentality that has dominated the rest of the episode. She suggests putting a hat on Stewie to cover the wound, using makeup to hide his injuries, and finding ways to blame someone else for what happened. Lois's transformation from horrified mother to willing accomplice in the cover-up represents one of the episode's most disturbing elements. Her initial reaction shows that she has normal protective instincts toward her children and appropriate emotional responses to seeing them harmed. However, the family's culture of deception and blame avoidance quickly overwhelms these healthy instincts. The speed with which Lois abandons her concern for Stewie's well-being in favor of protecting herself from consequences reveals how toxic family dynamics can spread from person to person. Even someone who initially responds appropriately to a child's injuries can be drawn into harmful patterns when surrounded by family members who prioritize self-preservation over child safety. This corruption of maternal instincts also highlights how abuse and neglect can become normalized within family systems. Lois's willingness to participate in covering up Stewie's injuries rather than ensuring he gets proper medical care shows how quickly people can abandon their moral principles when faced with social pressure and fear of consequences. Throughout all of these events, the most disturbing element remains the family's continued refusal to seek appropriate medical care for Stewie's obviously serious injuries. His condition continues to deteriorate, with his wound growing larger and becoming increasingly infected. Yet, despite obvious signs that he needs immediate hospital treatment, the family continues to prioritize their cover-up efforts over his health and safety. This medical neglect represents a form of child abuse that could easily result in permanent disability or death. Head injuries in infants are particularly dangerous because their skulls are still developing and their brains are more vulnerable to trauma. The infection and deterioration shown in the episode would likely cause severe brain damage if left untreated in real life. The family's willingness to risk Stewie's life rather than face consequences for their actions reveals a complete breakdown of normal family protective instincts. Parents are supposed to prioritize their children's safety above all other considerations, but the Griffins consistently choose their own comfort and convenience over Stewie's well-being. The episode finally ends with the family taking Stewie to the hospital, but only after Peter's scheme to make it look like Lois ran him over. Even this resolution comes not from genuine concern for Stewie's health, but from Peter's recognition that their cover-up attempts are no longer working. They seek medical care only when they have exhausted all other options for hiding what happened. Stewie eventually recovers from his injuries, appearing at the end of the episode with his head bandaged but apparently conscious and alert. However, his comment that he just found out it is November and wonders what happened suggests that he has lost significant time and memory due to his injuries, indicating that there may be lasting neurological effects from his trauma and the family's neglect. The fact that Stewie has no memory of what happened to him also means that he cannot hold his family accountable for their treatment of him during his injury. This amnesia conveniently protects the family from consequences while leaving Stewie vulnerable to similar neglect in the future if he is injured again. Brian Griffin's House of Pain serves as a disturbing illustration of how family dysfunction can escalate from minor conflicts to serious abuse and neglect. What begins as normal sibling rivalry quickly transforms into a medical emergency, then evolves into systematic cover-up efforts that prioritize the family's reputation over a child's safety and well-being. The episode reveals that this pattern of behavior is not new for the Griffin family. Peter's casual admission that he has been knocking his children unconscious for years suggests that violence and cover-ups are normal parts of their household dynamic. This history helps explain why Chris and Meg immediately assumed they needed to hide Stewie's injury rather than seeking help. The episode also demonstrates how toxic family dynamics can spread and corrupt even family members who initially respond appropriately to crisis situations. Lois's transformation from concerned mother to willing accomplice shows how quickly people can abandon their moral principles when surrounded by family members who prioritize self-preservation over doing the right thing. In short, in Brian Griffin's House of Pain, a simple sibling chase between Chris and Meg results in Stewie being knocked down the stairs and suffering a severe head injury that leaves him unconscious. Rather than seeking medical help, the children attempt to cover up the accident to avoid getting in trouble. When Peter discovers what happened, he praises their cover-up efforts and reveals a history of regularly injuring his children and teaching them to hide evidence. The family spends the episode using increasingly elaborate deceptions to hide Stewie's deteriorating condition, including dressing him in hats, painting fake eyes on his eyelids, and using coat hangers to puppet his movements. When their cover-up attempts fail, Peter throws the unconscious Stewie under Lois's car to create a new explanation for his injuries, successfully corrupting even Lois into participating in the deception rather than prioritizing Stewie's medical needs. If you are enjoying the breakdown, a subscribe helps before we continue. Moving on to Hannah Banana and the time Stewie threatened Brian's siblings with explosive collars. This episode reveals one of Stewie's most disturbing acts of coercion and violence, showing how his obsession with pop culture can lead to deadly threats against innocent victims. The episode begins with Stewie discovering that Hannah Montana is coming to perform at the Quahog Civic Center, triggering an immediate and intense desire to attend the concert. However, when Stewie tries to get tickets, he discovers that the show has already sold out, leaving him without any legitimate way to see his idol perform. This disappointment sets the stage for everything that follows, as Stewie's inability to accept that he cannot have what he wants immediately drives him toward increasingly desperate and violent measures. Rather than accepting that some things are not available or finding alternative ways to enjoy Hannah Montana's music, Stewie becomes fixated on attending this specific concert, regardless of the cost to others. The intensity of Stewie's reaction to being denied tickets reveals his fundamental inability to handle disappointment or accept limitations. Most children, while certainly upset about missing a favorite performer, would eventually move on or find other ways to cope with their disappointment. But Stewie's advanced intelligence, combined with his emotional immaturity, creates a dangerous combination where his sophisticated planning abilities serve his childish inability to accept no for an answer. When Stewie first reveals his obsession with Hannah Montana to Brian, the family dog's initial reaction is to tease and mock him for his interest in what Brian considers childish entertainment. This mockery represents Brian's typical intellectual snobbery, where he looks down on popular culture and assumes that his own sophisticated tastes make him superior to those who enjoy mainstream entertainment. However, when Stewie finally opens up about the genuine depth of his feelings for Hannah Montana, Brian begins to understand that this is not just a passing fancy or casual interest. Stewie's willingness to be vulnerable about his emotions touches something in Brian, leading him to reluctantly agree to help with getting concert access. This moment shows Brian's capacity for empathy when he recognizes genuine emotional need, even if he does not share or understand the specific interest. Brian's decision to help Stewie also demonstrates how their friendship operates. Despite frequent conflicts and philosophical differences, they ultimately support each other when it really matters. However, this support comes with the understanding that Brian is doing Stewie a favor, creating a dynamic where Stewie feels obligated to Brian's assistance rather than entitled to it. When Brian's initial attempts to help Stewie gain access to the Hannah Montana concert prove insufficient or too slow for Stewie's liking, the situation escalates dramatically. Rather than accepting Brian's limitations or waiting for alternative solutions, Stewie decides to use violent coercion to ensure Brian's complete cooperation. This decision reveals how quickly Stewie abandons gratitude and friendship when his desires are not immediately fulfilled. Stewie tracks down all 8 of Brian's siblings, demonstrating the extensive research and planning that goes into his scheme. This is not an impulsive threat made in a moment of anger. It is a calculated campaign of intimidation that requires significant time, effort, and resources to execute. The fact that Stewie puts this much work into threatening innocent animals shows the depth of his determination and the absence of moral restraints. The choice to target Brian's family members rather than Brian himself reveals Stewie's sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure. He recognizes that threatening people Brian cares about will be more effective than threatening Brian directly, since Brian might be willing to resist pressure on his own behalf, but would not want to see his siblings harmed because of his decisions. The most horrifying aspect of Stewie's coercion campaign is his use of explosive collars attached to Brian's siblings, with the clear threat that these devices will detonate if Brian does not comply with his demands. This represents an escalation from psychological intimidation to actual weapons, showing how far Stewie is willing to go to get what he wants. Stewie actually detonates one of these collars, killing one of Brian's siblings as a demonstration of his seriousness. This killing serves no purpose other than to prove that Stewie's threats are real and that he is genuinely willing to kill innocent animals to achieve his goals. The casual nature of this act reveals the complete absence of empathy or moral reasoning in Stewie's approach to problem solving. The fact that Stewie is willing to kill over concert tickets demonstrates how completely disconnected his actions are from any reasonable assessment of proportional response. Most people would consider missing a concert to be a minor disappointment, but Stewie treats it as a crisis worthy of deadly violence. This disconnect shows how his inability to regulate his emotions leads to catastrophically inappropriate responses to ordinary problems. Brian finds himself in an absolutely impossible situation where any choice he makes will result in harm to someone he cares about. If he refuses to help Stewie get into the Hannah Montana concert, more of his siblings will die. But if he complies with Stewie's demands, he becomes an accomplice to terrorism and validates Stewie's belief that violence is an acceptable way to solve problems. This moral trap reveals how hostage situations create psychological trauma for victims even when they survive physically unharmed. Brian must live with the knowledge that his decisions directly determine whether innocent animals live or die, creating an enormous burden of responsibility for outcomes that should never have been his to control. This psychological pressure can cause lasting damage even after the immediate threat is resolved. The situation also demonstrates how coercive tactics work by making compliance seem like the only rational choice, even when that compliance enables and encourages future violence. Brian's decision to cooperate with Stewie's demands may save his remaining siblings in the short term, but it also teaches Stewie that threatening innocent lives is an effective way to get what he wants. With Brian's coerced cooperation, Stewie and Brian manage to sneak into the Hannah Montana concert, where Brian helps facilitate Stewie's meeting with the performer herself. Brian tells Miley Cyrus that Stewie is her biggest fan and fabricates a story about Stewie having a brain tumor to generate sympathy and special access. This deception adds another layer of moral complexity to their scheme, as they are now manipulating a performer's kindness and concern for sick children to achieve their goals. The lie about Stewie having a life-threatening illness exploits Miley's natural desire to provide comfort to suffering fans, turning her compassion into a tool for Stewie's manipulation. The success of this deception also reinforces Stewie's belief that lying and manipulation are effective problem-solving strategies. Rather than learning that honest communication and patience might have achieved the same results, Stewie sees his violent coercion campaign as successful because it ultimately got him what he wanted. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the episode handles the aftermath of Stewie's campaign against Brian's family. There is no indication that Stewie faces any consequences for killing an innocent animal or threatening to kill others. The explosive collars simply disappear from the narrative once Stewie has achieved his goal, with no discussion of removing them or ensuring the safety of Brian's remaining siblings. This lack of consequences reinforces the pattern seen throughout many Family Guy episodes, where Stewie's most violent and antisocial behaviors are treated as temporary inconveniences rather than serious crimes with lasting impact. The absence of any accountability measures suggests that Stewie does not learn anything meaningful from this experience about the inappropriateness of his methods. The episode's resolution also fails to address the trauma that Brian and his siblings have experienced as a result of Stewie's actions. Being threatened with death, watching a family member die, and living under the constant fear of explosive devices would cause severe psychological damage in real life. But these effects are simply ignored in favor of moving on to other plot elements. Hannah Banana represents part of a broader pattern in Stewie's character, where his violent solutions to problems become increasingly sophisticated and deadly over time. Early in the series, his schemes were often cartoonish and unsuccessful, but episodes like this show him developing genuine dangerous capabilities that pose real threats to innocent lives. This escalation is particularly concerning because it shows Stewie learning from his experiences and becoming more effective at violence rather than developing better emotional regulation or problem-solving skills. Each successful use of intimidation and force teaches him that these methods work, encouraging him to rely on them more heavily in future situations. The specific choice to use family members as leverage also represents a particularly sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that goes beyond simple physical threats. Stewie demonstrates an understanding of human emotional bonds and how to exploit them for maximum psychological impact, showing a level of strategic thinking about violence that makes him genuinely dangerous. The episode raises disturbing questions about what happens when exceptional intelligence develops without corresponding emotional maturity or moral reasoning. Stewie's ability to plan and execute complex operations while remaining emotionally fixated on children's entertainment represents a dangerous combination that real-world child development experts would find deeply concerning. In normal child development, intellectual growth typically occurs alongside emotional and moral development, with children gradually learning to regulate their emotions and consider the impact of their actions on others. Stewie's character represents a complete breakdown of this normal developmental process, where cognitive abilities far outpace emotional and moral growth. The episode also illustrates how untreated behavioral problems in gifted children can escalate into genuinely dangerous situations if not addressed appropriately. Stewie's pattern of using violence to solve problems suggests underlying issues that would require intensive therapeutic intervention in real life, but the show's format prevents any meaningful exploration of these solutions. In short, in Hannah Banana, Stewie's obsession with attending a sold-out Hannah Montana concert leads him to threaten Brian's 8 siblings with explosive collars when Brian's initial attempts to help prove insufficient. Stewie actually detonates one collar, killing one of Brian's siblings, as a demonstration that his threats are real and serious. This act forces Brian to cooperate fully with Stewie's demands, helping him infiltrate the concert through deception and manipulation. The episode shows how Stewie's inability to handle disappointment, combined with his advanced planning abilities, creates a deadly combination where innocent lives become expendable in pursuit of his desires. The lack of consequences for his actions reinforces Stewie's belief that violence is an effective problem-solving tool, setting the stage for future escalations. Do subscribe before the next one if you are getting something out of this. Moving on to Patriot Games and its brutal loan shark violence against Brian. This episode showcases one of Stewie's most sustained and brutal campaigns of violence, demonstrating how his capacity for cruelty can escalate from casual threats to systematic torture over what begins as a relatively minor financial disagreement. The episode establishes that Stewie has become a bookie, taking bets on a celebrity boxing match between Mike Tyson and Carol Channing, treating this illegal gambling operation as just another business venture. When Brian places a $50 bet on Mike Tyson to win the fight, it seems like a safe wager given Tyson's reputation as a formidable boxer. However, in a shocking upset, Carol Channing defeats Tyson, leaving Brian owing money to Stewie's gambling operation. This unexpected outcome transforms what should have been a friendly wager between household members into a debt collection scenario that reveals the true depths of Stewie's violent nature. The fact that this conflict arises over such a relatively small amount of money makes Stewie's subsequent actions even more disturbing. $50 represents a minor financial obligation that most people would either forgive among friends or resolve through simple payment plans. However, for Stewie, this debt becomes an opportunity to exercise power and control through increasingly extreme methods of intimidation and violence. Stewie's first approach to collecting the debt appears relatively civilized, with him politely asking Brian for payment and suggesting that having the money by tomorrow would prevent any problems. This initial conversation is almost casual, with Stewie maintaining a friendly tone while delivering what amounts to a veiled threat about consequences for non-payment. However, even this seemingly polite interaction contains ominous undertones that reveal Stewie's mindset. When Brian asks what happens if he does not pay within 24 hours, Stewie responds with calculated ambiguity, saying he is not psychic, that he is just saying it would probably be better for everybody if Brian had the money tomorrow. This response shows Stewie deliberately creating psychological pressure through uncertainty and implied threats. The casual nature of this conversation also demonstrates how Stewie views violence and intimidation as normal business practices rather than extreme measures to be avoided. He does not seem to consider that threatening a friend over money might damage their relationship or that there might be alternative ways to resolve financial disagreements. Instead, he immediately establishes a framework where payment is mandatory and consequences for non-compliance are inevitable. When Brian fails to pay within the designated time frame and asks for an extension until the following Friday, Stewie's response is immediate and brutal. Rather than engaging in further negotiation or considering Brian's request, Stewie escalates directly to physical assault, smashing a glass of orange juice over Brian's head while he is vulnerable and just emerging from the shower. The casual way Stewie drinks the juice before using the glass as a weapon shows his calculated approach to violence, demonstrating that this assault is not an emotional outburst, but a deliberate tactical decision to establish dominance through pain and fear. What makes this attack particularly disturbing is how Stewie savors Brian's pain, repeatedly asking whether it hurt while continuing to assault him. This behavior reveals that Stewie derives genuine pleasure from inflicting suffering, transforming debt collection from a business transaction into an opportunity for sadistic entertainment. Following the initial glass attack, Stewie embarks on a prolonged campaign of torture that includes multiple forms of physical assault designed to maximize Brian's suffering while maintaining pressure for payment. Stewie punches Brian repeatedly, hits him with a towel rack, and forces his head underwater in the toilet, all while demanding payment and taunting his victim. This systematic approach to torture reveals Stewie's sophisticated understanding of how to use pain as a tool for psychological manipulation. Rather than simply beating Brian unconscious, Stewie carefully calibrates his violence to maintain Brian's awareness and ability to respond to demands, while ensuring maximum physical and psychological trauma. This calculated cruelty suggests experience with such techniques that goes beyond normal childhood aggression. The toilet dunking incident is particularly degrading because it combines physical danger with psychological humiliation, forcing Brian to experience both the terror of potential drowning and the shame of having his head forced into a toilet. This combination of physical and psychological abuse shows how Stewie understands that effective intimidation requires attacking both the body and the mind simultaneously. When Brian attempts to avoid further confrontation by disguising himself with a fake mustache and hat, Stewie's response demonstrates his commitment to pursuing the debt regardless of Brian's attempts to escape. Stewie immediately recognizes Brian despite the disguise and responds with even more severe violence, pushing him downstairs and hitting him with a golf club. This hunting behavior reveals how Stewie views the debt collection as a personal challenge to his authority rather than simply a business transaction. Brian's attempt to avoid him transforms what could have been a straightforward financial matter into a power struggle where Stewie feels compelled to demonstrate his dominance through increasingly extreme measures. The fact that Stewie tracks Brian down and attacks him in public spaces also shows his complete disregard for social norms and legal consequences. Most people would be deterred by the possibility of witnesses or police intervention, but Stewie's focus on asserting control over Brian overrides any consideration of external consequences or social appropriateness. As Brian continues to resist payment and plead for more time, Stewie escalates to using firearms, shooting Brian in both knees while he is already injured and vulnerable. This happens in response to Brian's admission that his fake mustache cost a few dollars, with Stewie treating this minor expense as evidence that Brian has money available for payment. The knee shootings represent a qualitative escalation in violence because they move from causing temporary pain to inflicting potentially permanent disability. Gunshot wounds to the knees can cause lasting damage to joints, muscles, and nerves, potentially leaving victims unable to walk normally for the rest of their lives. Stewie's willingness to permanently disable his friend over $50 shows a complete absence of proportional thinking. Stewie then follows the gunshot wounds with a flamethrower attack, actually setting Brian on fire while he is already wounded and helpless. This represents perhaps the most extreme form of torture shown in the episode. The fact that Stewie has access to military-grade weapons and is willing to use them against a friend demonstrates the full extent of his dangerous capabilities. Throughout this campaign of violence, Stewie employs sophisticated psychological warfare techniques designed to break down Brian's resistance and force compliance through fear and despair. His repeated demands about where his money is, combined with taunting questions about whether Brian likes it, show how he uses verbal abuse alongside physical torture to maximize psychological impact. The timing and pacing of Stewie's attacks also demonstrate psychological sophistication, as he alternates between periods of violence and brief respites that give Brian hope for mercy before delivering additional punishment. This pattern of intermittent reinforcement is particularly effective at breaking down psychological resistance because it prevents victims from adapting to a consistent level of threat. Stewie's casual demeanor during the most brutal attacks also serves as psychological warfare, as his calm discussion of mundane topics while inflicting severe pain creates cognitive dissonance that adds to Brian's trauma. The contrast between Stewie's friendly tone and his violent actions forces Brian to question his own understanding of reality and relationships. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this episode is how it completely destroys the friendship and trust that has existed between Stewie and Brian throughout the series. Their relationship has always been complex, involving conflicts and disagreements, but it has also been characterized by genuine affection and mutual support during difficult times. Stewie's willingness to torture Brian over money reveals that he does not actually value their friendship or Brian's well-being when these come into conflict with his desire for control and dominance. This realization forces Brian to confront the possibility that someone he considered a close friend is actually capable of treating him as nothing more than a victim to be exploited and abused. The episode also shows how quickly relationships can deteriorate when one person is willing to use violence to resolve conflicts. What begins as a simple financial disagreement rapidly escalates into a torture scenario that leaves permanent psychological and potentially physical damage. This pattern demonstrates how abusive individuals can exploit trust and emotional bonds to gain access to victims. The episode concludes with Brian finally agreeing to go to the bank and pay his debt, but only after being shot twice and set on fire. This resolution comes not from any recognition on Stewie's part that his methods were inappropriate, but simply because the torture has finally achieved its intended goal of forcing compliance through overwhelming pain and fear. The fact that Brian pays the debt under these circumstances does not represent genuine resolution of their conflict, but rather capitulation to intimidation. Brian's compliance is motivated entirely by fear of additional torture rather than any acknowledgement that he legitimately owed the money or that Stewie's collection methods were justified. Perhaps most disturbing is the apparent lack of consequences for Stewie's actions. There is no indication that he faces any legal prosecution for assault, attempted murder, or illegal weapons possession. Brian does not seek medical attention for his gunshot wounds or burn injuries, and there is no discussion of how this experience might affect their future relationship or Stewie's treatment of other people who cross him. Patriot Games represents a significant escalation in Stewie's capacity for sustained, systematic violence against people he claims to care about. While previous episodes had shown him capable of occasional violent outbursts, this episode demonstrates his ability to plan and execute extended torture campaigns with military-grade weapons and sophisticated psychological techniques. This escalation is particularly concerning because it shows Stewie developing genuine expertise in intimidation methods that could easily be applied to other victims in future situations. His systematic approach to breaking down Brian's resistance suggests study and practice with techniques that go far beyond normal childhood aggression or cartoon violence. The episode also reveals how Stewie's business ventures serve as cover for his violent impulses, allowing him to justify extreme behavior as necessary for legitimate financial purposes. This rationalization demonstrates his ability to create elaborate justifications for his most antisocial impulses while maintaining his self-image as a sophisticated businessman rather than a violent criminal. In short, in Patriot Games, Stewie's role as a bookie leads to Brian owing him $50 when Carol Channing unexpectedly defeats Mike Tyson in a celebrity boxing match. When Brian asks for more time to pay, Stewie responds with escalating violence that includes smashing a glass over Brian's head, beating him with various objects, forcing his head underwater in a toilet, and hunting him down when he tries to hide. The violence culminates with Stewie shooting Brian in both knees and setting him on fire with a flamethrower, finally forcing Brian to go to the bank and pay the debt. This sustained torture campaign over a minor financial obligation reveals Stewie's complete lack of proportional response and his willingness to permanently disable even his closest friends to assert dominance and control. Before we move on, subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the story on page 1 and its mind control matricide attempt. This episode showcases one of Stewie's most technologically sophisticated attempts at killing his mother, demonstrating how his advanced engineering capabilities can be directed toward eliminating family members who interfere with his plans. The episode reveals that Stewie has constructed a mind control device, representing a significant advancement in his technological arsenal beyond the simple weapons and gadgets he has used in previous schemes. This mind control technology represents a qualitative leap in Stewie's approach to problem solving because it allows him to manipulate others into carrying out his violent intentions rather than directly committing acts of violence himself. By controlling another person's actions, Stewie can achieve his goals while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding direct physical confrontation with his intended victims. The sophistication required to build functional mind control technology far exceeds anything that current real-world science has achieved, highlighting Stewie's extraordinary intellectual capabilities. The fact that he can conceive, design, and construct such advanced technology as a 1-year-old demonstrates the dangerous combination of genius-level intelligence and complete absence of moral restraints that defines his character. Rather than using his mind control device on Lois directly, Stewie makes the calculated decision to control Chris and use his older brother as an unwitting weapon in his matricidal scheme. This choice reveals Stewie's strategic thinking about how to maximize his chances of success while minimizing his own risk of detection or retaliation. Chris represents an ideal target for mind control manipulation because of his physical size and strength compared to Stewie, his general gullibility and lack of critical thinking skills, and his trusted position within the family that would allow him close access to Lois without arousing suspicion. By controlling Chris, Stewie gains access to capabilities he does not possess naturally while maintaining distance from the actual crime. The decision to use a family member as an unwitting accomplice also demonstrates Stewie's complete lack of concern for how his actions might affect Chris psychologically. If the scheme succeeded, Chris would be forced to live with the knowledge that he had killed his own mother, even though he had no conscious control over his actions. This disregard for Chris's mental health shows how Stewie views other people purely as tools to be used rather than individuals with their own feelings and well-being. Stewie's first step in implementing his plan involves using Chris to gather materials necessary for the murder, specifically targeting a tool shop to acquire a hand-operated buzzsaw capable of cutting through bone. This specific request reveals that Stewie has planned out the murder in gruesome detail, considering exactly what tools would be needed. The choice of a buzzsaw as the primary weapon indicates that Stewie is not planning a quick or merciful death for Lois, but rather a prolonged and brutal act that would cause maximum pain and suffering. His understanding of human anatomy and his determination to ensure the weapon will be effective for his intended purpose show the disturbing thoroughness of his planning. Stewie's remote control of Chris during this reconnaissance mission demonstrates the sophisticated nature of his mind control technology. He is able to monitor Chris's interactions, provide real-time instructions, and even engage in conversation through Chris's voice. This level of control suggests that the device does not simply influence behavior, but actually overrides the victim's consciousness entirely. When the shopkeeper questions Chris about why he needs such a dangerous tool, Stewie attempts to provide a cover story, claiming it is for a school project and that Chris is some sort of student, before fumbling over what subject might require such a tool and landing awkwardly on Latin class. This improvised explanation reveals both Stewie's quick thinking under pressure and his limited understanding of how normal educational institutions operate. The fact that Stewie struggles to come up with a believable academic subject that might require dangerous tools shows how his extraordinary intelligence exists alongside significant gaps in practical knowledge about everyday life. His reference to Latin class as a subject that might involve power tools demonstrates his disconnect from normal educational curricula and his inability to understand how regular students and teachers actually behave. The shopkeeper's refusal to sell power tools to minors represents the first obstacle that Stewie's scheme encounters, forcing him to confront the reality that even his sophisticated planning can be thwarted by basic safety regulations and legal restrictions. This setback reveals how Stewie's focus on technological solutions sometimes causes him to overlook simpler, practical barriers to his plans. When the shopkeeper refuses the sale, Stewie's control over Chris begins to break down, leading to an increasingly erratic and revealing public outburst. Chris, still under Stewie's influence, hurls elaborate insults at the shopkeeper, using language that clearly comes from Stewie's sophisticated vocabulary rather than Chris's normal speech patterns. This verbal assault escalates when Stewie apparently notices someone else in the shop and begins addressing them through Chris, complaining that he does not have any spare change and wondering aloud where he would even keep it, in his diaper. This outburst reveals that Stewie is still thinking from his own perspective as a baby while controlling Chris's adult-sized body, creating a disturbing disconnect between his mental state and physical appearance. The breakdown of Stewie's control system creates a public scene that draws unwanted attention to the mind control operation and potentially compromises the entire scheme. The fact that Chris begins speaking in Stewie's distinctive vocabulary and mannerisms while in an adult body would likely raise questions about his mental state, creating complications that Stewie had not anticipated. The malfunction of Stewie's mind control device during the tool shop incident reveals important limitations in his technology that suggest the system is not as reliable or sophisticated as it initially appeared. The fact that the device can lose signal or experience interference indicates that it operates through some form of wireless communication that can be disrupted by environmental factors or distance. Stewie's apparent surprise at the system malfunction, evidenced by his muttered question about whether the thing is still on, suggests that he has not fully tested the technology under real-world conditions. This oversight represents a significant flaw in his planning process and indicates that his confidence in his technological solutions may exceed their actual reliability. The public nature of this malfunction also creates potential evidence of Stewie's mind control activities, as anyone who witnessed Chris's strange behavior and unusual vocabulary might be able to connect it to external manipulation. This kind of exposure could lead to investigation and discovery of Stewie's broader criminal activities if the authorities became involved. Stewie's use of mind control technology raises profound questions about moral responsibility and free will that the episode does not fully explore. If Chris were to successfully kill Lois while under Stewie's control, who would bear legal and moral responsibility for the crime, the person who performed the physical actions or the one who controlled them through technological manipulation? In real-world legal systems, cases involving coercion typically focus on the degree of free will that the perpetrator possessed when committing crimes. However, the complete control that Stewie's device appears to exercise over Chris would likely be unprecedented in legal history, creating complex questions about how to assign blame and determine appropriate punishment. The episode also raises disturbing questions about consent and bodily autonomy, as Stewie is essentially using Chris's body without his knowledge or permission to commit crimes that Chris would never choose to commit on his own. This violation of bodily autonomy represents a form of assault in addition to the intended murder, showing how Stewie's crimes often involve multiple layers of violation against different victims. The mind control scheme represents part of a broader pattern in Stewie's approach to violence, where he increasingly seeks ways to achieve his goals without directly exposing himself to risk or consequences. Rather than confronting Lois directly, he manipulates Chris into becoming his weapon, creating distance between himself and the actual crime. This indirect approach to violence also serves Stewie's psychological needs by allowing him to maintain his self-image as a sophisticated mastermind rather than a common criminal. By using advanced technology and complex schemes, he can view his crimes as intellectual achievements rather than simple acts of brutality, feeding his narcissistic need to feel superior to others. The use of family members as unwitting accomplices also demonstrates Stewie's complete lack of empathy for the people closest to him. He is willing to destroy Chris's life and mental health in service of his own goals, showing that his capacity for manipulation and exploitation extends even to people who trust and care about him. The existence of Stewie's mind control technology creates ongoing dangers for every member of the Griffin family, as any of them could potentially be turned into unwitting weapons against the others. This technology represents perhaps the most dangerous tool in Stewie's arsenal, because it eliminates the possibility of resistance or self-defense by his intended victims. The fact that Stewie has successfully developed and tested this technology also suggests that he may create improved versions in the future, potentially expanding his ability to control multiple people simultaneously or exercise control over longer distances. This technological advancement represents an escalating threat that could eventually extend beyond the Griffin family to affect the broader community. The episode's failure to address the ultimate fate of the mind control device leaves open the possibility that Stewie retains this capability for future use. Without proper containment or destruction of the technology, every interaction between family members becomes potentially suspect, as any unusual behavior could indicate mind control manipulation. In short, in the story on page 1, Stewie constructs a sophisticated mind control device and uses it to manipulate Chris into serving as an unwitting weapon in a matricidal scheme against Lois. The plan involves controlling Chris to acquire dangerous tools, specifically a buzzsaw capable of cutting through bone, for use in a brutal murder. When Chris visits a tool shop under Stewie's control and requests the weapon for a supposed school project, the shopkeeper's refusal to sell power tools to minors creates the first obstacle. The mind control system then malfunctions during the interaction, causing Chris to speak in Stewie's distinctive vocabulary and make threatening statements that draw unwanted attention. This technological failure reveals limitations in Stewie's device and compromises the entire operation, while raising disturbing questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the ongoing danger that such technology poses to family members who could be turned into unwitting accomplices in future crimes. Take a moment to subscribe before we move on if this is landing for you. Moving on, we have The Big Bang Theory and its time travel assassination spree. The episode begins with what appears to be a simple verbal disagreement between Stewie and Brian, but quickly escalates into one of the most cosmically destructive conflicts in Family Guy history. It starts when Stewie mentions wanting to order something from a magazine, prompting Brian to make a mocking comment questioning Stewie's sexuality in a derogatory way. When Stewie attempts to respond with his own insult, he delivers what the episode describes as a terrible comeback that fails completely to achieve its intended effect. Instead of hurting Brian's feelings or establishing Stewie's verbal superiority, this failed comeback only provides ammunition for both Brian and Chris to mock Stewie even further, compounding his initial humiliation with additional ridicule from multiple family members. Rather than accepting this social defeat or learning from his mistake, Stewie immediately begins planning an elaborate revenge scheme that involves traveling through time to retroactively improve his comeback. This response reveals Stewie's complete inability to handle even minor social embarrassment, showing how his advanced intelligence serves his emotional immaturity rather than helping him develop better coping strategies. Stewie's initial solution to his humiliation involves using his time machine to go back and deliver a better insult to Brian, essentially cheating at social interaction by giving himself advanced knowledge of what Brian will say. This first intervention succeeds in allowing Stewie to top his insult, presumably delivering a devastating comeback that leaves Brian speechless and establishes Stewie's verbal dominance. However, rather than being satisfied with this victory, Stewie immediately begins planning additional time travel interventions to further humiliate Brian. This escalation reveals that Stewie's motivation is not simply to win the original argument, but to systematically destroy Brian's confidence and social standing through repeated temporal manipulation. The success of his first time travel intervention also demonstrates to Stewie that he can use his advanced technology to retroactively win any conflict or correct any mistake, creating a dangerous precedent where he no longer needs to accept consequences for his actions or learn from his failures. For his second temporal intervention, Stewie travels back to an earlier episode titled The Courtship of Stewie's Father, specifically targeting a moment when Brian was supposed to perform Peanut Butter Jelly Time for Peter while wearing a banana costume. By stealing Brian's banana suit and performing the song himself, Stewie not only prevents Brian from having this positive moment with Peter, but also takes credit for Brian's planned gesture. This sabotage represents a particularly cruel form of revenge because it does not just prevent Brian from succeeding, it allows Stewie to steal Brian's success and claim it as his own. The fact that Stewie's performance cheers up Peter means that Brian loses both the opportunity to make Peter happy and the recognition for having that positive impact on the family. The choice to target this specific moment also reveals Stewie's sophisticated understanding of what matters to Brian emotionally. Rather than simply causing physical harm or public embarrassment, Stewie attacks Brian's relationships and his ability to contribute positively to family dynamics, showing a calculated cruelty that goes beyond simple revenge. Emboldened by his previous successes, Stewie plans an even more devastating intervention by targeting Brian's romantic life, specifically his former date with a Victoria's Secret model. This escalation shows how Stewie's revenge campaign is growing more personal and destructive, moving from verbal comebacks to professional humiliation to romantic sabotage. When Brian discovers Stewie's plan to interfere with his romantic relationships, he recognizes that the situation has moved beyond acceptable boundaries and decides to actively stop Stewie's temporal manipulations. This represents one of the few times that Brian takes decisive action to prevent Stewie from carrying out a harmful scheme, showing that even he has limits on what he will tolerate. The fact that Stewie would target Brian's romantic life reveals his understanding that attacking someone's personal relationships can cause lasting psychological damage that extends far beyond the immediate incident. By preventing Brian from having positive romantic experiences, Stewie could potentially damage his friend's self-confidence and ability to form healthy relationships in the future. When Brian attempts to stop Stewie from sabotaging his romantic life, their physical struggle for control of the time machine results in both of them being launched outside the space-time continuum, where the laws of physics do not apply and where the return pad cannot get them home. This accident transforms their personal conflict into a cosmic crisis that threatens their very existence. The description of their location as a place where the laws of physics do not apply suggests that they have been transported to a realm beyond normal reality where their actions could have unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. The fact that their return mechanism no longer functions means they are essentially stranded in this dangerous environment with no clear way home. This escalation from a simple insult exchange to cosmic displacement demonstrates how Stewie's inability to handle minor social conflicts can spiral into disasters of unprecedented scale. His advanced technology, when combined with his emotional immaturity and vindictive nature, creates situations where personal grievances become threats to universal stability. Faced with being trapped outside normal space-time, Stewie makes the desperate decision to overload his return pad, causing an explosion that he hopes will send them back to their proper time. However, this explosion turns out to be far more significant than either Stewie or Brian initially realizes, as subsequent research reveals that Stewie's device malfunction actually created the Big Bang and caused the formation of the entire universe. This revelation transforms Stewie from a vindictive child seeking revenge into the inadvertent creator of all existence, giving him a level of cosmic responsibility that no one, let alone an emotionally immature baby, should possess. The fact that the universe was created as a side effect of Stewie's petty revenge scheme highlights the absurd and terrifying scale of power that his advanced technology grants him. The discovery that he created the universe also provides Stewie with a new source of narcissistic pride, as he can now claim to be literally the most important being in existence. This cosmic validation of his superiority complex could potentially make his future behavior even more dangerous, as he now has ultimate justification for believing himself above normal moral and social constraints. The episode's conflict escalates dramatically when Bertram, Stewie's half-brother and longtime rival, witnesses Stewie purchasing plutonium from a terrorist operative and decides to use this information to launch his own time travel attack. Bertram's plan involves preventing Stewie from ever being born, which would create a paradox that prevents the Big Bang and potentially erases all of existence. Bertram's infiltration of the Griffin House and his theft of Stewie's time machine technology demonstrates that Stewie's advanced inventions pose ongoing security risks that extend far beyond his own misuse of them. When other individuals with criminal intent gain access to these devices, the potential for catastrophic damage multiplies exponentially. The fact that Bertram's plan threatens to erase the entire universe shows how conflicts between supernaturally intelligent infants can escalate to cosmic scales with potentially infinite casualties. What begins as sibling rivalry between two babies evolves into a threat to all existence, highlighting the dangerous combination of advanced technology and emotional immaturity. To prevent Bertram from erasing him from existence, Stewie and Brian travel back to Renaissance Italy, specifically to the time period when Leonardo da Vinci was alive. The episode reveals that da Vinci is actually Stewie's ancestor, explaining the source of his extraordinary intellectual capabilities and technological genius. This historical setting transforms their conflict from a modern science fiction scenario into a period adventure, but the violence and stakes remain just as high. The fact that Stewie and Bertram are willing to fight their battle in the past, potentially disrupting major historical events and figures, shows their complete disregard for the broader consequences of their actions. The involvement of Leonardo da Vinci also adds cultural and historical significance to their conflict, as any damage to this legendary figure could have profound effects on human artistic and scientific development. Stewie and Bertram's willingness to risk da Vinci's life for their personal vendetta demonstrates their complete lack of concern for human achievement and cultural heritage. The conflict between Stewie and Bertram escalates into aerial combat using Leonardo da Vinci's early flight inventions, creating a unique combination of Renaissance technology and futuristic warfare. This battle sequence represents one of the most visually spectacular and technologically complex fights in Family Guy history, demonstrating both characters' advanced combat capabilities. Stewie manages to deflect a missile during this aerial battle, ultimately destroying Bertram's glider and forcing him to crash. This combat sequence shows that both infants possess not only advanced intelligence and technology, but also sophisticated military training and combat reflexes that allow them to engage in complex tactical warfare. The use of historical flying machines as weapons of war also represents a corruption of Leonardo da Vinci's peaceful inventions, turning tools of human advancement into instruments of destruction. This transformation reflects how Stewie and Bertram's conflict corrupts everything it touches, turning positive human achievements into sources of violence and chaos. When the aerial battle concludes with Bertram's defeat, he responds by taking Leonardo da Vinci hostage at Crossbow Point, threatening to kill the legendary artist and inventor unless Stewie surrenders. Despite warnings from both Stewie and Brian that killing da Vinci could destroy the universe by preventing Stewie's birth, Bertram executes the Renaissance master anyway, showing his complete willingness to risk universal destruction for personal revenge. This murder represents one of the most historically significant assassinations in the Family Guy universe, as Leonardo da Vinci is widely considered one of the most important figures in human history. His death at Bertram's hands eliminates countless artistic masterpieces, scientific discoveries, and technological innovations that would have advanced human civilization. The casualness with which Bertram commits this historically catastrophic murder reveals the complete absence of moral reasoning that characterizes his approach to conflict resolution. Like Stewie, he views other people, even legendary historical figures, as expendable obstacles to achieving his personal goals rather than as valuable individuals with their own rights and contributions. Following Leonardo da Vinci's murder, Stewie responds with immediate and brutal violence, fighting Bertram for control of the crossbow and ultimately shooting his half-brother in the chest and the head, ensuring his death through multiple fatal wounds. This execution represents the culmination of their sibling rivalry, with Stewie finally eliminating his longtime rival through direct violence. The fact that Bertram is shot in both the chest and head suggests that Stewie wanted to ensure his half-brother's death beyond any possibility of survival, demonstrating a level of thorough brutality that goes beyond simple self-defense or revenge. This method shows Stewie's complete commitment to eliminating threats to his existence through whatever means necessary. Stewie's willingness to commit fratricide also reveals how his survival instincts override any familial bonds or moral considerations he might have regarding killing relatives. Despite sharing genetic material and having a long history with Bertram, Stewie shows no hesitation or remorse about ending his half-brother's life when it serves his interests. After killing Bertram, Stewie faces the problem that Leonardo da Vinci's death should have prevented his own birth and potentially destroyed the universe. However, when the universe continues to exist, Stewie realizes that there must be a slim chance of himself being born even without Da Vinci in his family tree. Stewie's solution to this temporal paradox involves becoming his own ancestor by injecting his DNA into Leonardo's girlfriend, essentially ensuring his own genetic lineage through direct intervention. This plan requires him to violate others' bodily autonomy to solve his problems. The success of this plan also means that Stewie creates a temporal loop where he is responsible for his own existence, making him literally self-made in the most complete sense possible. This cosmic narcissism reinforces his belief in his own superiority and importance, while eliminating any need to acknowledge dependence on others or gratitude for his existence. To complete his plan of becoming his own ancestor, Stewie cryogenically freezes himself in Leonardo da Vinci's basement, waiting centuries for Brian to discover and revive him in the present day. This long-term planning demonstrates Stewie's willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for ultimate control over his own destiny and timeline. The image of Stewie frozen in the Griffin family basement for hundreds of years, while the family unknowingly lives above him, adds a darkly comic element to the episode's conclusion. It also suggests that Stewie's influence on history extends far beyond the Renaissance period, as he has literally been present throughout his family's entire lineage. When Brian finally discovers and revives Stewie, the episode reveals that Stewie had planned every aspect of this temporal manipulation from the beginning, demonstrating a level of long-term strategic thinking that borders on omniscience. This revelation transforms him from a reactive character responding to Bertram's threats into a mastermind who orchestrated his own cosmic significance. In short, in The Big Bang Theory, Stewie's failed attempt to deliver a witty comeback to Brian escalates into a cosmic conflict involving time travel, historical assassination, and universal creation. After using time travel to retroactively improve his insults and sabotage Brian's performances, Stewie accidentally creates the Big Bang when their fight over the time machine launches them outside space-time. When Bertram attempts to prevent Stewie's birth to undo the universe's creation, the conflict moves to Renaissance Italy, where Bertram murders Leonardo da Vinci before being killed by Stewie with crossbow shots to the chest and head. To resolve the temporal paradox and ensure his own existence, Stewie injects his DNA into Da Vinci's girlfriend and cryogenically freezes himself for centuries, becoming his own ancestor and orchestrating his cosmic importance through murder, genetic manipulation, and temporal paradox resolution. If you are enjoying the breakdown, a subscribe helps before the next one. Moving on, we have Brian and Stewie, which involves psychological manipulation and a somber conversation about whether life is worth living. This episode represents one of Family Guy's most psychologically complex outings, stripping away the show's typical format to focus entirely on the relationship between two characters trapped in an increasingly intimate and uncomfortable situation. The episode begins when Stewie and Brian find themselves accidentally locked in a bank vault, creating a claustrophobic environment that forces them into closer contact than either character typically experiences or desires. The vault setting serves as more than just a plot device. It creates a pressure cooker environment where normal social boundaries and defense mechanisms gradually break down over time. Unlike their usual interactions, which can be interrupted by other family members or external distractions, the vault forces Stewie and Brian to confront each other and themselves without any possibility of escape or deflection. The accidental nature of their entrapment also means that neither character has time to prepare emotionally or psychologically for the intense experience that follows. They are forced to deal with immediate practical problems like hygiene and basic survival needs, which creates vulnerability and dependency that neither character is comfortable experiencing or acknowledging. One of the episode's most disturbing elements occurs early in their confinement when Stewie soils his diaper out of fear when the vault door closes. This incident transforms what could have been a simple waiting situation into a hygiene crisis that forces both characters to confront uncomfortable realities about dependency, bodily functions, and the limits of their friendship. Stewie demands that Brian clean and change him despite the obvious practical problems, and escalates his demands into increasingly degrading requests. These demands represent a form of psychological manipulation, where Stewie uses his apparent helplessness to force Brian into humiliating situations. What makes this scenario particularly disturbing is how Stewie frames these demands as necessary practical solutions rather than acknowledging the humiliating and potentially harmful nature of what he is asking Brian to do. His casual tone while describing these activities shows his complete disconnection from normal social boundaries and his willingness to exploit Brian's trapped situation for his own comfort and psychological gratification. Brian actually complies with at least some of Stewie's degrading demands, which reveals how quickly normal psychological defenses can break down under extreme circumstances and how dependency relationships can become exploitative when one person holds all the power. Stewie's commentary during these acts, including his casual instructions and his subsequent gratitude, shows his complete awareness of the psychological impact these demands have on Brian. Rather than simply solving a practical problem, Stewie appears to derive genuine satisfaction from forcing Brian into subservient and humiliating positions. The fact that Brian goes through with these demands, despite their obvious degrading nature, suggests that the vault environment has already begun to break down his normal psychological resistance and self-respect. This rapid psychological deterioration demonstrates how quickly extreme circumstances can force people to abandon their usual moral and social boundaries. The episode's most somber turn occurs when Stewie discovers that Brian keeps a gun in his safety deposit box. This discovery transforms the episode from an uncomfortable comedy about being trapped together into a serious exploration of depression, hopelessness, and the emotional pain that Brian has been hiding. When Stewie presses Brian about why he owns the gun, Brian's eventual admission reveals a level of psychological pain and despair that has never been explicitly addressed in the series before. This confession shows that underneath Brian's intellectual pretensions and social confidence lies a deep well of depression that he has been hiding from everyone around him. The casual way that Brian discusses these feelings suggests that he has been living with them for a significant period of time, and his matter-of-fact tone indicates that this is not an impulsive thought for him, but rather something he has been carrying for a while. When Brian opens up about his emotional pain, Stewie's response demonstrates a concerning lack of empathy and understanding about mental health. Rather than expressing genuine concern for Brian's well-being or offering meaningful emotional support, Stewie responds with callous, dismissive dark humor, treating his friend's despair as an intellectual puzzle or a source of jokes rather than a crisis requiring compassion and care. This response reveals Stewie's complete inability to recognize the seriousness of what Brian is telling him, and his failure to provide appropriate emotional support during Brian's moment of vulnerability demonstrates how his advanced intelligence does not extend to emotional intelligence or basic human compassion. His detached clinical approach to Brian's pain shows that he views it as an interesting problem to solve rather than a person's genuine suffering that deserves empathy and care. As the episode progresses, Stewie appears to recognize that Brian's emotional vulnerability creates an opportunity for manipulation and control. Rather than respecting Brian's privacy or offering genuine support, Stewie uses Brian's confession as a foundation for building false intimacy that serves his own psychological needs. Stewie eventually declares his love for Brian, but this confession comes only after he has forced Brian into degrading situations and extracted deeply personal information about Brian's struggles. This timing suggests that Stewie's declaration of love is less about genuine affection and more about capitalizing on Brian's emotional vulnerability to create a sense of dependency and obligation. Stewie's approach to expressing love also reveals his manipulative understanding of how emotional declarations can be used to control relationships. By waiting until Brian is at his most vulnerable and then offering emotional validation, Stewie creates a psychological dynamic where Brian feels grateful and indebted to someone who has actually been exploiting his weaknesses. When Stewie declares his love, Brian reciprocates by saying he loves him too, but the context makes it unclear whether this response represents genuine emotion or the product of their extreme circumstances. The vault environment has created such an artificial and intense situation that normal emotional responses may be compromised or distorted. Brian's willingness to return Stewie's declaration of love could represent an unhealthy attachment to someone who has been controlling and manipulating him throughout their confinement. Alternatively, it might reflect genuine gratitude for what appears to be the first acknowledgement he has received regarding his emotional pain, even though that acknowledgement came in a highly problematic context. The episode structure makes it impossible to determine whether the emotional connection between Stewie and Brian represents authentic bonding or trauma bonding resulting from their shared ordeal. This ambiguity reflects real-world situations where extreme circumstances can create intense but unhealthy emotional attachments between people. Throughout their confinement, both Stewie and Brian undergo significant psychological changes that demonstrate how quickly isolation and dependency can alter personality and behavior. Brian's willingness to perform degrading acts and accept emotional manipulation shows how rapidly his normal self-respect and boundaries deteriorated under pressure. Similarly, Stewie's behavior during the confinement reveals aspects of his personality that are normally hidden by the family's chaotic environment. His systematic manipulation of Brian's vulnerability and his exploitation of their trapped situation show a level of calculated psychological cruelty that goes beyond his typical cartoon violence. The episode also demonstrates how extreme circumstances can force people to confront aspects of themselves and their relationships that they normally avoid examining. Brian's hidden emotional pain and Stewie's capacity for emotional manipulation both emerge only because their normal coping mechanisms and social masks have been stripped away by their situation. The episode concludes with both characters expressing love and mutual appreciation, but this apparent resolution masks the serious psychological damage that has occurred during their confinement. Stewie's exploitation of Brian's vulnerability and Brian's submission to degrading treatment represent forms of harm that cannot be undone by emotional declarations or expressions of friendship. The fact that both characters seem to treat their ordeal as a bonding experience rather than recognizing the manipulative and harmful dynamics that occurred suggests that neither has gained genuine insight into their relationship or their own psychological patterns. This lack of awareness means that similar exploitation could easily occur again in future stressful situations. The episode's treatment of Brian's emotional pain is particularly problematic because it presents these serious concerns as background elements in a relationship drama, rather than addressing them as urgent issues that in real life would call for professional support and ongoing care. Brian and Stewie serves as a concentrated example of the toxic relationship dynamics that characterize much of the Griffin family's interactions. The episode shows how quickly caring relationships can become exploitative when one person recognizes and takes advantage of another's vulnerabilities and dependencies. Stewie's behavior during this episode represents an escalation of his typical pattern of using superior knowledge and resources to control and manipulate others. However, the vault setting allows him to exercise this control more completely and systematically than usual, revealing the full extent of his capacity for psychological manipulation. The episode also demonstrates how trauma and extreme circumstances can create the illusion of deep emotional connection while actually reinforcing harmful relationship patterns. The intensity of shared suffering can mask ongoing exploitation and prevent victims from recognizing when they are being manipulated. In short, in Brian and Stewie, the two characters become trapped in a bank vault, creating an intense psychological pressure cooker that forces them into uncomfortable intimacy and dependency. Stewie exploits their situation by forcing Brian to perform degrading acts, using Brian's trapped circumstances to break down his psychological defenses and self-respect. When Stewie discovers that Brian is carrying deep, hidden despair, he responds inappropriately with callous humor rather than offering genuine emotional support. Throughout their ordeal, Stewie systematically manipulates Brian's vulnerability and eventually declares his love only after establishing psychological control, while Brian's reciprocal declaration appears to result from their traumatic situation rather than authentic affection. The episode presents serious emotional issues as elements of relationship bonding, failing to address the genuine concerns and unhealthy dynamics that emerge during their confinement. Take a second to subscribe before we finish if this has been worth your while. Moving on, we have Death Has a Shadow and Stewie's early matricidal attempts with advanced weapons. This very first Family Guy episode establishes Stewie Griffin as a character capable of shocking violence and sophisticated criminal planning from his earliest appearance. The episode introduces viewers to what would become one of television's most disturbing baby characters, showing that Stewie's capacity for evil and his obsession with killing his mother were present from the very beginning of the series. The episode shows Stewie working on what he calls a mind control device while sitting at the family dinner table, treating the construction of advanced weaponry as casually as other children might play with building blocks. When Lois tells him no toys at the table, Stewie's response reveals both his sophisticated vocabulary and his murderous intentions, cursing her and complaining that she has impeded his work since the day he escaped her wretched womb. This early interaction establishes the fundamental dynamic that will drive much of Stewie's violent behavior throughout the series, his view of Lois as an obstacle to his plans who must be eliminated. His reference to escaping from her wretched womb and calling his birth a kind of victory shows that he views his own existence as a triumph over maternal oppression rather than a gift of life. The mind control device that Stewie constructs in this first episode represents the beginning of his long campaign to develop technological solutions for killing his mother. Rather than relying on simple weapons or physical violence, Stewie immediately demonstrates his preference for sophisticated, high-tech approaches that reflect his advanced intelligence and engineering capabilities. Stewie refers to the device as nearing completion, indicating that this is not an impulsive project, but rather a carefully planned and executed engineering effort. His ability to construct such advanced technology while appearing to be a normal baby demonstrates the dangerous combination of genius-level intellect and complete moral vacancy that defines his character. The choice to build a mind control device rather than a simple weapon also reveals Stewie's understanding that direct confrontation with Lois might not be successful. By controlling her mind, he could potentially force her to harm herself or others, creating the perfect crime where the victim becomes the perpetrator. This sophisticated approach to murder planning shows criminal thinking that far exceeds normal childhood aggression. When Lois refuses to return his device and maintains her no toys at the table rule, Stewie's response contains a clear threat of future violence, warning her to mark his words, that when she least expects it, her comeuppance will arrive. This statement represents more than childish defiance. It is a genuine promise of retribution that Stewie fully intends to fulfill. The phrase demonstrates Stewie's sophisticated vocabulary while also serving as a veiled death threat. Most one-year-old children would respond to parental authority with crying or tantrums, but Stewie responds with calculated promises of revenge that he has the intelligence and technological capability to execute. This early threat also establishes the pattern that will characterize Stewie's relationship with Lois throughout the series. He views any attempt to parent him or set boundaries as an act of war that justifies violent retaliation. His inability to accept even basic household rules shows how his advanced intelligence serves his emotional immaturity rather than helping him develop better social skills. Later in the episode, when Lois accidentally falls due to a loose chair leg, Stewie's reaction reveals his ongoing murder plans and his frustration when circumstances prevent him from taking credit for violence against his mother. He exclaims in annoyance when he realizes that Lois's injury was accidental rather than the result of his sabotage efforts. This reaction demonstrates that Stewie has been actively working to create dangerous situations for Lois, likely including loosening furniture or creating other household hazards that could cause her serious injury or death. His disappointment at not being responsible for her fall shows that he does not simply want Lois to be harmed. He wants to be the one causing that harm. The incident also reveals how Stewie's murder attempts are integrated into everyday family life, with him constantly looking for opportunities to eliminate his mother through seemingly accidental means. This approach shows his understanding that successful matricide requires careful planning and plausible deniability rather than obvious violence. The episode's climax occurs in a courtroom where Peter is being sentenced for welfare fraud, providing Stewie with an opportunity to test his mind control technology on Judge Blackman. Stewie attempts to use his device to influence the judge's decision, initially failing, but eventually succeeding in forcing the judge to give Peter his job back. This public demonstration of mind control technology represents a significant escalation in Stewie's criminal activities, moving from private murder attempts to open manipulation of the justice system. His willingness to use advanced weapons in a courtroom full of witnesses shows complete disregard for legal consequences or social norms. The fact that Stewie's device initially fails, but then succeeds, suggests that his technology is still in development and may not be completely reliable. However, his persistence in using it, despite the initial failure, shows his commitment to perfecting these weapons, regardless of the risks involved. Stewie's successful mind control of Judge Blackman demonstrates his understanding that authority figures can be just as vulnerable to manipulation as ordinary citizens. By forcing the judge to reverse his decision about Peter's employment, Stewie shows that he views the entire legal system as another obstacle to be overcome through technological superiority. The mind control is successful when swirly lines appear in Judge Blackman's eyes, suggesting that Stewie's device creates visible evidence of mental manipulation. This obvious sign of technological interference should have alerted everyone in the courtroom to what was happening, but it apparently goes unnoticed by all the adults present. This incident also reveals how Stewie's advanced technology can be used to benefit his family when it serves his interests, even though his primary focus remains on eliminating threats to his own plans. His decision to help Peter suggests calculated self-interest rather than genuine family loyalty, as keeping Peter employed likely serves Stewie's broader goals. Death Has a Shadow establishes several key patterns that will characterize Stewie's violent behavior throughout the series: his preference for high-tech solutions to interpersonal problems, his view of family members as obstacles to be eliminated or controlled, and his complete lack of moral restraints when pursuing his goals. The episode shows that Stewie's capacity for violence is not something that develops over time, but rather something that exists from his earliest appearances. His immediate resort to advanced weaponry and mind control technology indicates that he views violence as a normal and appropriate response to any form of opposition or frustration. The sophistication of his planning and execution also demonstrates that Stewie's violent tendencies are accompanied by genuine criminal intelligence and technological capability. Unlike typical childhood aggression, which tends to be impulsive and poorly planned, Stewie's violence is systematic, calculated, and increasingly effective over time. The weapons and methods introduced in Death Has a Shadow serve as prototypes for the increasingly deadly devices that Stewie will develop throughout the series. His mind control technology, in particular, represents the beginning of his exploration into psychological manipulation and mental domination as tools for achieving his goals. The episode also establishes Stewie's willingness to use his family members as test subjects for his various schemes, treating them as expendable resources rather than people deserving of care and protection. This callous attitude toward human life becomes a consistent feature of his character development. Perhaps most significantly, the episode shows that Stewie's violent behavior exists independently of any external provocation or trauma. He is not responding to abuse or neglect. He simply views violence as an efficient solution to problems and has the intelligence to implement sophisticated attacks against anyone who opposes him. What makes Stewie's behavior in Death Has a Shadow particularly disturbing is how it is presented as normal family dysfunction rather than genuine domestic terrorism. His open threats against Lois, his construction of advanced weapons, and his manipulation of legal authorities represent serious crimes that would warrant immediate intervention in any real-world scenario. The family's casual acceptance of Stewie's behavior also establishes a pattern of enabling that allows his violence to escalate without consequences. Rather than recognizing the genuine danger he poses, they treat his threats and weapons as amusing quirks of a precocious child. This normalization creates an environment where Stewie can continue developing increasingly deadly capabilities without facing appropriate intervention or treatment. The episode suggests that untreated violent behavior in gifted children can escalate to genuinely dangerous levels when family systems fail to provide appropriate boundaries and consequences. In short, in Death Has a Shadow, the very first Family Guy episode, Stewie establishes his pattern of matricidal violence by constructing a sophisticated, mind control device at the family dinner table while openly threatening Lois with future retribution. When she confiscates his weapon, he promises that her comeuppance will come, a genuine death threat disguised as childish defiance. His disappointment when Lois accidentally falls due to a loose chair leg reveals his ongoing efforts to create dangerous situations for his mother through household sabotage. The episode culminates with Stewie successfully using his mind control technology to manipulate Judge Blackman in a courtroom, forcing the judge to reverse his decision about Peter's case. This first episode establishes Stewie's preference for high-tech solutions to interpersonal problems, his view of family members as obstacles to be eliminated, and his complete willingness to use advanced weapons against anyone who opposes his plans. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.